The sky turns the color of iron. Wind howls down the valley, swallowing mountains and fence lines in a single white breath. A shadow kneels at the north pasture. A blade flashes. 3 strands of wire fall silent into the snow. The cut ends shine bright, too clean, too deliberate for any storm. Not the weather. Someone opened the fence on purpose. The wind rises higher. The night becomes a wall of white. Horses panic, 12 of them. Hooves hammer frozen ground. They scatter into the dark, running blind toward higher country, toward worse. By morning the pasture stands empty. Snow drifts chest high. Silence where hooves ought to be. A man stands in the drift up to his thighs. He shouts names into a wind that takes every name and never gives them back. He keeps shouting. The cold settles into his chest and does not leave. The valley sat quiet under a sky the color of iron. That whole week, mountains rimmed white on every side. The creek running black and slow beneath a crust of ice, thick enough to walk on if a man had the nerve. Smoke rose thin and straight from a handful of chimneys scattered across the valley floor. The only sign, from a distance, that anybody lived out here at all. It was hard country. Beautiful. Most days. In the particular way, hard country is beautiful, unforgiving, and honest about it, never once pretending to be gentler than it was. 3 days. That's how long I sat with the cold in my chest before I let it win. 3 days of riding every draw and gully between here and the Sulphur Fork. 3 days of calling names into a wind that took the names and never gave them back. 3 days of coming home at dark with my hands too stiff to unsaddle my own horse, and Ezra taking the reins from me without a word, because there was nothing to say that hadn't already been said the night before. And on the morning of the 4th day, I stopped. Just stopped. Pulled my boots off. Set them by the door like a man setting down a rifle he's done firing. I want you to understand what that meant, because it wasn't giving up on a chore. Wasn't giving up on a fence line or a leaking roof or a bad crop of hay. It was 12 horses, my whole breeding string. 6 years of choosing which mare went to which stud. 6 years of watching foals hit the ground and knowing before they'd even found their legs which ones would carry the name Shaw somewhere it mattered. 6 years. Gone into a wall of white in one single night. So I sat on the porch step. Coffee in my hand, gone cold an hour before I noticed, watching the trail, not because I expected anything to come down it, because there was nothing else left worth watching. 33 years old, both hands scarred from wire and rope, and 10 winters of work that never quite let up. A ranch that cleared just enough most years to keep the roof from caving, and now nothing in the north pasture but snow drifted chest high, and a silence where hooves ought to be. You get to a certain point in a man's life, and the arithmetic just stops working. I'd felt this particular stillness before. 6 years back, the bad stretch. The one where I sold down to almost nothing 3 mares, a stud that wasn't worth half what I'd paid, and started the whole thing over from a hole. So deep I still dreamed about the bottom of it some nights. I remembered the quiet from that time too, the way a place goes still when you've quit fighting it. Like the land itself is waiting to see what you'll do next. Except this time I'd already decided. There was nothing left to wait for. My father built this place out of nothing, back when nothing was still cheap enough for a man with more want than money to buy his way into. He used to say a ranch wasn't land. Said land was just dirt until you'd bled on it enough times to call it something else. He bled on this ground for 30 years, died in the same bed he was born close to, 3 miles east of here, and left me a house, a herd, and a debt so tangled I spent 2 years just learning the shape of it before I could start paying it down proper. I was 23 when he passed the whole thing to me. Too young, everybody said so. Said it to my face and behind my back both. I proved most of them wrong for 4 good years. Then I proved the rest of them right for 2 bad ones. Then I switched this operation over from cattle to horses and clawed back up again. Slower, meaner about it. 6 years of building, until the string in that north pasture was the thing folks pointed to when they wanted to say the Shaw place had turned itself around. 6 years of clawing, undone in one night. I thought about the night the storm hit. I hadn't stopped thinking about it, not really. Not once in 3 days. The way the sky had gone the color of a bruise by 4 in the afternoon. The way I'd told myself the horses would hold in the north pasture, because they always had. Because the fence there had held through 6 winters running, and there was no reason on God's earth to think this one would be different. I was wrong. I'd been wrong before. I'd just never been wrong at that particular cost. By midnight the wind was doing things I'd only heard old-timers describe. The kind of wind that finds every seam in a wall and turns it into a mouth. By morning the fence line was buried and the pasture was empty, and I stood out there in snow to my thighs, shouting names into nothing, and Ezra came out after me with a lantern and put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Garrett, you'll freeze before you find them like this. Come inside, wait for light." I didn't wait for light. I went out anyway. Rode every gully I knew and some I didn't, until my horse was blown and I had to turn back or lose him too. I remember the exact moment I understood how bad it was going to be. Not the first hour of the storm, not even the first night. It was the second morning, riding the ridge above Sulphur Fork, when I came across a single set of hoof prints, heading the wrong way entirely north, into higher country, into worse country, a horse running blind and terrified with no thought left in it but away. I followed those prints 2 hours before. The wind erased them clean off the mountain, and I never did find which of my 12 had made them. That was when the hoping stopped being hoping and started being something closer to prayer, the kind a man says without meaning to, under his breath, riding alone in weather too loud to hear his own voice in anyway. 3 days of that, and on the fourth morning I let it go. The light came up gray in the east, slow, grudging the way December light comes up in this country, like the sun itself doesn't much want the day either. I watched it and thought about numbers. What 12 horses would have brought at spring sale if I'd had them to sell. Whether Jonas Vane's man might pay something for breeding rights on his stud for a single season, just to wring a little income out of the 2 mares I still had penned close to the house. Whether the ranch was even a ranch anymore, without the string that had made it one. The numbers ran badly. They always did lately. That was the truth of it, the thing I hadn't said out loud to anyone, not even to Ezra. I'd been running this place on grit for longer than grit alone was meant to carry a man. Eliza used to sit at that kitchen table behind me, with a ledger open and her chin set just so, and she'd look at the whole ugly truth of a bad year straight on, without flinching, and without pretending it was better than it was. She had a way of reading a column of figures like it was a face she trusted to tell her the truth, even when the truth wasn't kind. I learned more about running this ranch from watching her read a ledger than I learned in 10 years of running it myself. 3 years she's been gone now. 3 years with Dent, and some mornings it still catches me sideways, not the grief exactly. I'd made a kind of peace with the grief, or told myself I had. It was the absence of her particular quiet that caught me, the specific shape of a silence where her voice used to be, telling me plainly what a thing cost and whether it was worth it. That was the kind of morning it was. Cold cup, empty trail, a man doing arithmetic that wouldn't come out right, thinking about a woman who used to make it come out right just by looking at it straight. And then I heard them. If you've worked horses your whole life, you know the sound without deciding to know it. It goes past your ears and straight into some older part of you. Hooves on frozen ground, but scattered. Spread wide, uneven, the particular rhythm of many animals moving as one. Not one horse, not 2, a whole string. I was on my feet before I'd decided to stand. The coffee tipped cold over my knuckles, and I didn't feel it. Not then, not until later when I noticed the stain on my sleeve and couldn't place where it came from. They came around the bend where the trail narrows hard against the rock face, the place where a rider has to slow no matter how badly they want to run. Bunched tight there the way horses bunch when the ground turns mean underfoot. I started counting the second the first head cleared the rocks. 1, 2, 3. I got to 8 before I stopped counting horses and started trying to understand what was moving behind them. A rider, on a mule, not a fine mule, a big, ugly, hard-headed gray thing, the kind built for mountains, and nothing prettier than mountains. Sitting that mule like she'd done it every day of her life, and expected to keep doing it till the day she died. A duster coat gone the color of old rust from years of weather, a hat too large for her, sitting low over her ears, hiding whatever was underneath it. One hand loose on the reins, the other resting easy on her thigh, holding a coiled rope the way a person holds a rope when they've used it hard and expect to use it again before the sun's down. She drove those 12 horses straight into my yard, stopped them there, looked at the house the way a person looks at they haven't decided yet whether to trust. I finished counting. 12. All 12. I didn't move. Couldn't. My mind was still back on that porch step, still sitting with the boots by the door, and my body hadn't caught up yet to what my eyes were telling it plain as day. She looked at me. These yours? 2 words, and 3 days came undone in the space it took her to say them. They are, I managed. My voice came out rough, like a gate that hadn't swung open in a while. Found them in a box canyon past the second ridge. She said it plain. No performance in it, no waiting for me to be grateful. Big Sorrel had herself wedged between 2 rock faces, hind leg caught in a crack, took most the morning working her loose. I looked past her, counting again foolish, because I'd already counted twice. 12. Ezra came out of the barn at a near run, hat still in his hand, and stopped dead in the yard like he'd walked into a wall nobody else could see. He was 51, going gray at the jaw, had worked this place 11 years and buried enough hope alongside me to know exactly what he was looking at. He'd come to Wyoming, a widower himself, years back, with a younger wife now who kept a small house in Millbrook and a cough that worried him more than he liked to say out loud. He and I had shared enough hard winters by now that we didn't need many words between us to understand each other. This morning was no exception. "Lord," he said, "just that," and had to take his hat off entire and hold it against his chest like a man at a graveside who'd just watched the dead sit up. "They're sound," she said. "Mare will need watching a day or two. Leg's not broke, but she pulled against it a good while before I found her, so there's swelling." I got my mouth working again, finally.
"How'd you know they were mine?"
She nodded toward the south gate, where the post still carried the brand plate I'd nailed up years back and half forgotten about. Same mark on every animal in that string. Wasn't hard to figure. Her name was Josephine Larkin. Everyone called her Jo, she told me later, because Josephine took too long to say and she'd never once needed the extra syllables to get her point across. She was 29 days out from a cattle outfit down in the Texas Panhandle, where she'd spent 3 seasons breaking horses for a man who paid her half of what he paid his men and expected a thank you for the privilege. She didn't say thank you. She said goodbye instead and rode north with a bedroll, a length of good rope, and a mule named Ulysses that nobody else on that whole outfit could sit for longer than a minute at a time. 29 days. That's the piece of information that took me the longest to make peace with. A woman, alone, on that road, through that country, in that season, and she told it to me like it was a plain fact, and not the kind of thing that would make most folks look at her sideways. I brought the horses into the south pasture while she watered the mule. She didn't ask where the trough was. She found it herself, led Ulysses over, watched his feet while he drank, checking for stone bruises without anybody having to ask her to. She was practical with animals the way you only get from growing up around them, not from reading about them in some almanac. That's a difference you can spot in about 4 seconds, if you know what you're looking at. I got the sorrel mare into her own paddock and checked the leg myself, though Jo had already told me what I'd find, swelling from the knee down. Nothing broken. Thank God for that much. The mare put weight on it, tender but willing, which is the thing you watch for. A horse that won't bear weight at all is a different kind of trouble entirely. I stood there a long while, just looking at the mare, at all 12 of them moving loose and easy in the pasture like they'd never left it at all. At the plain, impossible fact of them being here, when an hour before I had decided, with my whole chest, that they were gone for good. She stayed for supper, because I asked her to, because the light was already starting to go, and there was no sense pushing a mule for more cold miles when there was a barn and a warm stove sitting right here, doing nobody any good empty. That's the practical version of why she stayed. The true version includes the fact that I had to ask her twice before she said yes, and the way she looked at the barn before she looked at the house, making sure the animals would be settled and cared for before she gave one thought to herself. I made what I had, salt pork, cornbread that had gone a little dry sitting 2 days, the last of a jar of pickled beets I'd been saving for no reason I could name, some habit of Eliza's that had stuck to me the way habits do after a person's gone. Jo ate every bit of it and didn't comment either way, which I respected more than she probably knew. Some folks make a performance out of eating plain food, especially women who'd expected something finer. She didn't make a performance out of anything. She ate like a person who'd gone hungry enough times to know better than to waste a full plate on manners. We sat at the table after, coffee going between us, the lamp throwing yellow light across the wood grain Eliza used to polish on Sunday afternoons. "Condition of your north pasture," Jo said. "You had horses scatter before, in weather like this?" "Once. 6 years back. Different storms, smaller. They stayed close that time. Didn't run half so far. This one ran them hard." She turned her cup slow between her palms. "Fence give way, or did they go over it?" I hadn't thought to ask myself that question yet. Too busy being grateful they were back to wonder how they'd gotten loose in the first place. "I'll have to look tomorrow," I said. "Didn't think that far yet." She nodded like that answer satisfied her for now and let the subject rest. I told her about the breeding program instead, what I'd been building toward those 6 years, which stallion crossed well with which line, the mare I'd paid too much for 4 years back because I knew, down in my gut, what she'd throw, and I'd been right about it every single time. "What'd you pay for her?" Jo asked. "The one you knew about. More than sense allowed." Ezra thought I'd gone soft in the head. "Had you?" "Maybe some. But I'd watched her dam throw 3 foals for a neighboring outfit down in Colorado before I ever laid eyes on her, and every one of those 3 had the same particular way of carrying themselves. Something in the shoulder. You could pick them out of a mixed herd from 200 yards. Easy, once you knew what you were looking for. And she's thrown that same shoulder here. Every time." Jo nodded slow, like I'd confirmed something she'd already half suspected from watching the horses move that first evening. That's not luck, she said. Folks like to call breeding luck when it goes right and bad judgment when it goes wrong, but it's neither one, not really. It's just paying closer attention than the next man, over a longer stretch of time than most men have patience for. You sound like you've thought on this before. I've thought on most things before, she said, without a trace of boasting in it, just the plain accounting of a fact. Not much else to do on a long ride but think. Joe listened the way people listen when they actually want to tow a thing, not the way most folks listen while they wait for their turn to talk again. She asked good questions. Not showy ones, not the kind meant to prove she knew something. The kind that told me, without her having to say it plain, that she knew horses a good deal deeper than most. That mule of yours got a name? I asked, mostly to see what she'd say. Ulysses, like the general. Stubborn as one too, and about as hard to talk out of a bad decision once he's set on it. A flicker of something almost like a smile. Man who sold him to me swore he was gentle. Man who sold him to me was a liar. Why keep him then? Because underneath the stubborn he's got more sense than most horses I've ridden. Gets a man through country a smarter animal might balk at, on account of he's too pig-headed to know he ought to be scared. She looked at me sideways. Reminds me of a few ranchers I've met, if I'm honest. That a compliment or an insult, Miss Larkin? Depends entirely on the rancher. Grew up on a farm in Illinois, she said, when I finally asked where all that knowledge had come from. Horses and mules both. My father ran a small operation. Nothing near the size of this. What brought you west? She thought about that a moment. Didn't rush the answer, which was different from most people, who answer before you've even finished asking. There was nothing left to stay for, she said finally. My mother passed 2 years back. Farm got sold to cover what was owed on it. I was keeping ledgers after that for a shipping outfit in the city. Fine enough life if you like the same day over and over. A pause, longer this time, like she was deciding how much more to hand me. I'm not built for the same day is the plain truth of it. I understood that better than I let on. She slept in the spare room that night, was up before me the next morning, which I hadn't expected of a woman who'd ridden hard the day before, and worked a mare's leg loose from a rock crack besides. When I came into the kitchen, she'd already been out to the barn and back, checked the mare, come back satisfied. The swelling's down already, she said. She's putting weight on it clean. Good sign. Then she asked if she could use a little flour and salt to make proper biscuits, because the cornbread had been fine enough, but she'd been thinking about biscuits the whole ride in from the second ridge. I told her to help herself to whatever she found. She made biscuits. Found the half-forgotten ham in the cold box and sliced it thin and fried it up golden. Found the 3 hens I kept out of nothing but habit and used their eggs besides. We ate better that morning than I had in 6 months. Maybe longer. I didn't say that out loud, but I thought it hard enough that I half expected her to hear it. She drank her coffee black. Ate without talking much, watching the pasture through the window the whole while. The dark chestnut, she said, out of nothing. He's off, I looked. The horses moved slow around the hay I'd pitched out that morning. Which one? Flaxen mane. Watch his left shoulder when he steps out. I watched. She was right, same as she'd been right about the sorrel's leg. A slight hitch, nothing dramatic, the kind of thing you'd miss clean if you weren't looking for it on purpose. Hit something in the storm, probably. Running blind in the dark. Hard enough to bruise, but not break. Probably will work itself out on its own. She said it easy, certain, the way you say a thing you already know to be true, and don't need convincing on. Went back to her coffee like the matter was settled. After breakfast she asked, plain, if I had a horse in the string that nobody had gotten a saddle onto yet. I did. A 2-year-old bay colt, quick-tempered, that I'd been putting off starting because I hadn't had the patience for a fight that particular winter. Show me, she said. I brought him out to the round pen, figuring I'd watch her get thrown once, learn her limits and go back to my morning chores with the matter settled, one way or the other. She didn't get thrown. She stood in the center of that pen a long while first, doing nothing at all that I could see the sense of, just standing, letting the colt circle her, snort at her, test the edges of how close he'd come before his own nerve failed him. Ezra came and leaned on the rail beside me, arms crossed, watching same as I was. She's not doing anything, Ezra said low. She's doing something, I said, though I couldn't yet have told you what. It took the better part of an hour. She never raised her voice above talking level, never made a fast move, not once the whole time. Just stood and shifted her weight this way and that and let that colt work out on his own that she wasn't a thing worth fearing. By the time she had a hand flat on his neck, he was breathing slow and even ears loose, the fight gone clean out of him, without a single loud word spent making it go. You break horses like that in Texas? I asked her, when she finally came to the rail. I don't break horses, she said. Breaking's a word for men in a hurry. I ask them a question and wait on the answer. What's the question? She looked at me over the colt's back, that same straight red she gave everything. Whether they trust me enough yet to be told what to do. A pause. Same question works on most anything, far as horses, people. Difference is horses answer honest a good deal faster. Ezra laughed out loud at that, a short bark of a thing, and shook his head slow like he was revising an opinion he'd held since breakfast. I've had that colt 3 weeks and got nowhere near that. I said, you've had a lot on your mind 3 weeks running. She said it without unkindness, just fact, the way she said most things. Colt could likely feel that on you same as I could. I didn't have an answer for that, because it was true, and there's a particular kind of quiet that settles on a man when somebody's told him something. True, he hadn't yet said to himself. She worked the colt another 20 minutes. Easy circles. A hand on the flank, no rope raised in anger the whole while, and when she led him back to the gate, he followed her. Like the pen had never held any argument between them at all. He'll take a saddle inside the week, she said, handing the lead rope over. Go slow the first few times. He'll test you same as he tested me. Don't take it personal when he does. Wasn't planning to. Men usually plan to, she said, right up until the moment they don't. That afternoon, with the colt cooling out in his pen and the light still holding golden low over the western ridge, I asked if she wanted to see the rest of the place before she made up her mind about anything. She said she did. We walked the whole boundary I could show her in an afternoon. The upper pasture, still scarred pale where the drift had piled deepest against the tree line. The creek, running slow and black between snow-crusted banks. The one my father used to say was the whole reason this particular stretch of ground was worth staking a claim on at all. The old cattle shed at the north corner, empty these 6 years since I'd switched the operation over to horses. Its boards gone silver with weather, still standing stubborn against everything the winters had thrown at it. Why horses, she asked, and not cattle? Most outfits your size in this country run cattle. Cattle's a market, you're always racing, I said. Prices move, and you move with them, and mostly you're a step behind no matter how hard you run. Horses, if you breed them right, you're not racing anybody. You're building something particular, something that didn't exist in the world till you decided it should. She was quiet, a moment, looking out over the pasture where the 12 moved easy in the low light, the flaxen-maned chestnut testing his shoulder careful with every other stride. That's not a rancher talking, she said finally. That's a man talking. Same thing most days. Not always. She looked at me sideways from under that too big hat. Plenty of ranchers out here just racing the market same as everybody else, hoping to get lucky before the ground gives out under them. You're not racing anything, you're building towards something particular, same as you said. Different animal entirely, pardon the expression. I laughed at that, surprised myself doing it. Out there in the cold with my breath fogging white between us. We stood at the fence a while longer, not talking, watching the horses graze down the last of the day's light. And there was a particular ease to that silence I hadn't felt shared with another soul in 3 years running. Not the silence of two people who'd run out of things to say. The silence of two people who'd said enough for the moment, and trusted the other one not to need filling it up with noise for noise's own sake. I didn't ask her to stay past that morning. I want that clear because what came after could sound, told wrong, like something I'd planned or steered toward. I hadn't planned a single hour of it. What happened first was the fence. I went out that afternoon to walk the north line, the section that had held the horses before the storm, wanting finally to understand how 12 animals had scattered clean across 3 miles of bad country in a single night, when the same fence had held through 6 winters running without so much as a sagging post. I found the wire a half-mile east of where the drift would have piled worst. Cut, not snapped from the weight of leaning horses, not torn loose by wind working at a weak joint over seasons, cut clean. 3 strands, severed with something sharp and deliberate, the ends bright where they hadn't yet had time to rust. I stood there a long while with my hand on that wire, running my thumb along the cut edge, like it might tell me something more if I touched it long enough. Straight cuts, even. A blade did this. Not weather, not bad luck, not the storm at all. Somebody opened that fence on purpose and then let the storm do the rest of the work and let the weather carry the blame for it. I didn't say anything to Joe that evening. Told myself I needed to think it through clean before I said it out loud to another soul. Told myself a dozen small reasons that were really just one big reason I didn't want to say the words and make them true in front of somebody I'd known less than 2 days. But I couldn't stop turning it over at supper, at the table, in the quiet after. Then the storm hadn't scattered my horses. Somebody had, and there was only one man in this whole valley, with reason enough to want my horses gone, and my ranch weak enough to sell cheap and quick. Jonas Vane owned the spread 2 ridges over. along with better than half the water rights running through Willow Creek besides, and for 2 years now he'd been buying up the small outfits along the valley floor for prices that made grown men wince and sign the paper anyway, because a low price today beats no price at all if the alternative is losing everything come spring. Talk in Millbrook had the railroads surveying a line through this country inside 2 years' time. Talk had Vane knowing that particular piece of news well before anybody else did. He'd made me an offer on this land 8 months back. I'd told him no. He'd smiled at my no like a man who expected to hear it the first time, and something different the second. I didn't say any of this to Joe. Not yet. I put the thought in a back room of my mind, same as I'd learned to do with things I couldn't fix in a single evening, and I shut the door on it. I did tell Ezra the next morning, walking him out to the cut section myself, before either of us had eaten. He crouched by the post a long while, same as I had, running his own thumb along the same bright, even edge. Blade did this, he said finally. No question. That's what I figured. He stood, brushed the snow from his knees, and for a moment his face did something. I couldn't quite read a tightening around the eyes. There and gone. The way a man's face moves when he's turning something over, he'd rather not be turning over. You think in vain, he said. Not a question. Man's made me an offer twice this year already. Third time he'll likely try different words for the same thing. He's made offers to half the valley. Ezra said, careful, his eyes on the wire instead of on me. Denton spread. The coal place before they sold up and moved on. Man collects land the way some fellas collect debts owed them. Doesn't mean he's out here at night with a knife. Doesn't mean he isn't, either. Ezra was quiet a long moment, longer than the conversation strictly called for. No, he said finally, low. Doesn't mean he isn't. I noticed the pause. Filed it away without knowing yet what to do with it. The way you notice a cloud on the horizon that might be nothing, might be everything, and there's no telling which from that distance. Keep this between us a while, I told him, till I've got more than a cut wire and a bad feeling. You know I will. He said it fast, maybe too fast, and clapped a hand on my shoulder and turned back toward the barn before I could look at his face again close enough to decide what I'd seen there. I want to say I thought hard on that pause of his. Truth is I didn't, not that morning. I had a woman in my kitchen who'd ridden 29 days alone, through hard country, and a colt taking his first saddle inside the week, and a mare's leg healing clean, and a fence to mend, and a mind too full of good things happening all at once to leave much room for worrying over one hired man's uneasy quiet. I'd have cause to remember it later. I didn't have cause yet. The second storm came in that same night. Hard, sudden, the kind that doesn't announce itself gradual, it simply arrives. All at once, like a door slammed by a hand you never saw coming. Joe had loaded Ulysses that afternoon, said her goodbyes proper, gotten maybe a mile down the trail before the wind turned the whole world the color of milk. She came back a little after dark, snow shaking off the brim of that too big hat, and said she supposed she'd be needing that spare room one more night. If the offer still stood. It stood. She stayed 4 more days. In those 4 days I learned things about Josephine Larkin the way a man learns a new country, slow at first. And then, till you look up and realize you know the shape of the whole territory without recalling exactly when you learned it. She didn't sleep late, and she never once left a job half finished. She found the crack running through the mortar around the stovepipe on the second morning, pointed it out plain, and asked if I had the mix on hand to fix it. I did. She watched me work it, asked one sharp question about why I mixed it the ratio I did, and I could see her, filing the answer away somewhere for later use. The way a person files things they mean to need again. The third day she rehung the kitchen door that had dragged hard against the sill 2 winters running. A chore I kept meaning to get to and kept somehow never getting to. She didn't mention it before she did it. Didn't mention it after either. I came in for the noon meal and the door swung clean on its hinges for the first time in 2 years, and that was the whole conversation we had about it. A closed mouth and an open door. I rode into Millbrook that same afternoon for feed, leaving Joe to the ranch and Ezra to whatever he was fixing next without being asked. The road in was hard-packed and slow, and I had time enough riding it to think about how little I'd been to town since the storm, and how much I'd been dreading going. Silas Whitmore ran the feed store same as his father had before him, and he'd always been a talker, the kind of man who could turn a 5-minute purchase into a 20-minute accounting of everybody's business in the valley whether you asked for it or not. He was civil to me that afternoon, weighed my order proper, took my money proper, wished me well proper. Didn't ask about the horses, though. Didn't ask a single question about the storm, or how I'd fared, or whether I needed anything besides what I'd already listed. A year back he'd have talked my ear clean off about it, and pride for details besides, the way a small town pries out of habit more than malice. This year he just weighed the feed and made change and let the silence between us do whatever talking it meant to do. I passed the Denton place on the ride out, saw smoke from their chimney, didn't stop. We'd done business twice a year most years, buying and selling stock between our two outfits. They hadn't bought from me in going on 2 years now. Not since the bad stretch had started showing on my books in ways a careful neighbor could read from the outside. That was their right. Didn't make it sting any less, watching that smoke rise, and knowing there'd been a time I'd have turned in at that gate without a second thought and been welcome for it. I thought about what Joe had said, riding home in the fading light, that the valley people were wrong about me. It was a fine thing to hear, sitting warm at my own table with her certainty right there in the room to lean on. It felt a good deal thinner out on that road alone, passing a neighbor's smoke and a feedman's careful politeness with nothing but my own doubt for company the last 3 miles home. But I held on to it anyway, turned her words over like a coin in my pocket, worn smooth from handling, and found they still held their shape even 3 miles out from where she'd first spent them on me. She read too, in the evenings, when the work was done and there was nothing left to fix that day. Found the 3 books I owned, a territorial almanac gone soft at the corners, a history of this region I'd bought off a peddler and never finished, and a novel Eliza had carried west from her mother's house, the one I'd read twice myself because there was nothing else on that shelf worth reading twice. Joe took the history, finished half of it the first evening by lamplight, the rest the second, and talked about it plain and unhurried at supper. On the third night, like she'd been turning the land grant disputes and the water rights arguments over in her head the entire ride up from Texas, and had simply been waiting for a place to set the thoughts down. She wasn't passing through this country. She was learning it, the way you learn a thing you intend to know for a long while. There's a whole chapter in there on the water rights fights from the 70s, she said at supper that third night, pushing a piece of cornbread around her plate without eating it, her mind clearly still back inside the book. Man who wrote it seems to think the small outfits mostly lost those fights on account of not understanding their own claims well enough to defend them, not because the claims were weak, because nobody'd bothered explaining the claims plain, in language a rancher without a law degree could stand up and argue. Most of us don't have the time to go reading law between calving season and haying, I said. No, she agreed, which is exactly how the ones who do have the time end up owning everything downstream of everybody who doesn't. Ezra, over by the stove scraping the last of the beans from the pot, gave a short laugh. She's not wrong, Garrett. Didn't say she was. Willow Creek runs through 6 spreads before it ever reaches Vane's land, Joe said, and near as I can tell from that book, the water rights on this whole stretch were never settled clean to begin with. Just assumed. Handshake and habit, going back to when your father and men like him first staked claims. Something in my chest went still and careful at that. The way a man goes still when a stranger says out loud a worry he's been carrying alone, so long he'd half forgotten it was a worry, and not just a fact of life. You saying that's a problem. I'm saying handshake and habit hold up fine, she said, right until somebody with money and a lawyer decides they don't want it to hold up anymore. She looked at me steady across the lamplight. I don't know your neighbor Vane from Adam, but if I were building toward buying up a valley quiet, piece by piece, I'd want the water settled in writing before I ever had to fight a man over pasture. I didn't answer that right away. Ezra had gone quiet by the stove, scraping at a pot that surely didn't need scraping anymore. You think too much for a woman just passing through on her way to a bookkeeping job, I said finally, meaning it kinder than it might have sounded. I think exactly the amount most people ought to, and don't bother with, she said. Comes from watching my own family lose a farm to men who thought harder about the paper than we ever did about anything but the work. She set her fork down. Papers outlast Garrett every time. I learned that the hard way once already. I'd rather other folks learn it from a book than from losing everything the way we did. Nobody said much after that, but I lay awake a long while that night turning the thought over water rights never settled clean, going back to my father's day, and a man 2 ridges over who wanted my land bad enough to offer for it twice already. On the 4th day, mid-afternoon, we walked the near pasture together, checking the chestnut gelding's shoulder, which had loosened some but not entirely. She crouched by his foreleg with a patience I hadn't seen in a person, in longer than I cared to count, running her hand slow down the line of the muscle, feeling for the give. He'll be sound in a week, she said. 10 days at the outside. You sound certain. I am certain. She stood, brushed the snow from her knees, looked at me with that same straight read she gave everything. Certainty's not the same as guessing lucky, Mr. Shaw. Certainty's what you get from paying attention enough that the animal tells you the truth before it happens. Garrett, I said, you've been sleeping under my roof 5 days. No sense in the mister. Something almost like a smile crossed her mouth, then there and gone so quick I might have imagined it if I hadn't been watching close. Garrett, she said, trying the shape of it. All right. We stood there a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. The wind had died down some, the way it does in the hour before evening settles in proper, and the horses moved easy around us in the pale light, and neither one of us seemed in any particular hurry to be the one who broke the quiet first. Ezra broke it for us, hollering from the barn that supper was near ready, on account of he'd taken to cooking since Joe arrived, not wanting her to think the whole ranch ran on my one recipe of salt pork and cornbread. We walked back together. Didn't talk the whole way. Didn't need to. The fourth night, the wind finally let go of the house entire, and we sat by the stove after Ezra had turned in, and I told her more about this ranch than I'd told another living soul in 3 years running. The original claim my father staked. What it looked like when I first ran cattle here instead of horses before I understood the ground better and switched over. The bad stretch 6 years back when I sold down to nearly nothing and started over with 3 mares and more stubbornness than sense, and how close that had come to being the end of the whole enterprise. She listened to all of it and didn't offer comfort, which was exactly right, because there's nothing comforting to say about a man who nearly lost everything once already and knows, in his bones, he could lose it again. But you built it back, she said. Not a question. A statement, flat and certain as the ones she made about horses. Took a while. Most things worth having do. Then she asked about Eliza, quiet like she'd been waiting the whole evening to find the right door to knock on. I don't talk about Eliza easily, not with anyone, not even with Ezra, who'd known her nearly as long as I had. But I told Joe the way we'd worked this place together in the early years, the way she read a ledger like it, owed her the plain truth and nothing less, the way the fever had come on fast at the end, taking 3 weeks to do what it did, and how the house had felt too large and too quiet ever since. Joe didn't say I'm sorry. I've heard that phrase worn smooth by 100 well-meaning mouths until it means almost nothing at all. She said instead she sounds like someone worth knowing. She was. And you've run this place 3 years without her. I have. She nodded slow, let it sit there in the space between us, didn't push past it toward some easier subject, which was, again, exactly right, and which told me more about her than anything she might have said instead. Sometimes, I said, before I'd fully decided to say it, I still set 2 cups down of a morning. Catch myself halfway to pouring the second one before I remember. That's not foolishness, Joe said. That's just love that hasn't found a new shape to live in yet. I didn't answer that. Couldn't, not right away. Sat with it instead, the way you sit with a thing that's landed somewhere true and needs a minute before you can move past it. You ever set a second cup down for your mother? I asked her, once I'd found my voice again, before you caught yourself. Joe looked into the stove a while before she answered, the fire throwing moving light across her face. For a long time, she said. Longer than I'd have admitted to anybody asking. My father died when I was young enough not to remember him proper. My mother was the whole of what I had after that. When she went, I didn't just lose a person. I lost the last soul on this earth who remembered me as a child. There's nobody left now who knew me before I was already grown and hard about things. That's a particular kind of alone. It is. She turned her cup slow in her hands the way she did when she was deciding how much further to go. I used to think grief was a door you walked through once and came out the other side different. Older women I met after women who'd lost husbands, children, they set me straight on that. Told me it's not a door, it's a room. You don't walk through it and leave. You just learn, over time, where the furniture is, so you stop barking your shins on it in the dark. I thought about that a long while. Thought about the ledger drawer I still couldn't open some mornings, and the way I'd learned, slow, over 3 years, exactly which floorboards in the hallway still creaked the way they had when Eliza was alive to hear them. I've learned where the furniture is, I said. Some nights I still find a new piece I didn't know was in there. That's not weakness, Garrett. She said my name plain, no hesitation left in it now, the way she'd have said the name of anybody she'd decided to trust. Man who's stopped finding new furniture in a room like that is a man who's stopped feeling anything worth the name. I'd rather bark my shin than go numb. Eliza used to say something close to that, I said quiet. Word for word, near enough it. Near stopped my heart hearing you say it. She looked at me a long moment across the lamplight, and neither of us reached to fill the silence that followed, and I sat with a small private wonder the rest of that evening at how a woman I'd known 5 days could land so close to the exact words of a woman I'd loved 7 years, like grief and love ran the same well-worn path in anyone honest enough to walk it. The fifth one came up clear and hard blue, the kind of cold that makes the air itself feel like it might crack if you spoke too loud into it. There was no reason left for her not to ride. She had a position waiting on her in Millbrook, 4 days out if the weather held steady, and she'd already spent 9 days more on this ranch than she'd ever planned to. I fed Ulysses myself and brought him around to the yard while she gathered her few things. She came out with her bag and tied it on slower than the task strictly required, like she was giving herself time to say something she hadn't yet decided how to start saying. She stood by the mule a long moment. "The valley people," she said finally. "The ones who know you. Do they think poorly of you, on account of the trouble you've had?" I didn't answer right off. Thought hard about what the honest answer actually was. The way the feed man in Millbrook had gone careful and polite these last months instead of chatty the way he used to be. The way a small valley keeps a quiet tally on a man whether he asks it to or not, and says opinion slow, like sediment. Some do. She looked at me straight then. Joe had a particular way of looking at a person, not unkind, not sitting in judgment, just reading, careful and thorough, like she wanted badly to get the reading right and wouldn't settle for anything less. "They're wrong," she said. Just that. No elaboration offered, none needed. Said the way a person states a fact they've already gone and checked twice against the evidence. I didn't know what to say back to that, so for a moment I didn't say anything at all, because what was there to say? Because a man doesn't get told he's been misjudged by half a valley, by a woman who's known him 5 days and read him clearer than most who've known him 5 years, and just hand back some easy word like thanks. Thanks didn't fit the size of it. Nothing fit the size of it, not that I could find standing in that cold yard with my breath fogging between us. So I said nothing, and she let the nothing sit there, comfortable, the way she let most things sit exactly as long as they needed to. She picked up the reins, didn't mount yet. "I spent 5 days watching you work, Garrett Shaw." My name in her mouth, full and plain. "You fixed 3 things nobody on this earth asked you to fix. You knew that Mare's leg was healing clean before you'd said one word to me about it. How long have you kept this whole place running?" 10 years, since my father passed it down to me. Alone, the last 3 of those. 10 years. She repeated it slow, like she was setting the number down somewhere safe to keep. "They're wrong about you. Whatever they're saying in that town, whatever tally they've been keeping, wrong." She put her foot in the stirrup, got up onto that ugly gray mule with an ease that still, after 5 days of watching her do everything with that same ease, managed to surprise me. Looked down at me from there, the morning light catching under the brim of that too large hat. "I'm going to ride into Millbrook," she said. "Look the job over close. See if it's really what I thought it was when I signed on for it back in Texas. That sounds reasonable enough." A pause. She looked out past me, toward the horses moving loose in the south pasture, like she was buying herself one more second before she finished whatever she'd started. And then she said, "I might ride back this way. Tell you plain what I found." I held on to everything I wanted to say in that moment, and there was a great deal of it, more than I had words ready for, and gave her something simpler instead, something true enough to stand on its own. "I'd want to hear it," I said, "whatever you find." She rode out. I stood in the yard a long while after the sound of Ulysses's hooves had gone quiet against the frozen ground, swallowed up by distance and the particular silence that follows a person leaving. Told myself I wouldn't think on it too hard. That's a lie, and I knew it was a lie even as I told it to myself, standing right there in my own yard with my breath fogging the cold air. A man doesn't spend 5 days watching someone read his whole ranch clearer than he's read it himself in years, and then simply set the thought aside like a tool he's finished using. I went back to work instead, because the work was there, and because work is what a man does with a thought he can't yet afford to sit still with. The fence line needed mending, the real fence, the whole lower run, not just the cut section I'd found and left alone, wanting Ezra's red on it before I said anything to the sheriff. That lower run had been asking for attention since October, and I'd been finding smaller chores to hide inside instead of tending to it. That's a habit of mine, and I knew it even as I did it again, finding lesser work to bury myself in so I don't have to sit still with the larger thing waiting underneath. 2 days with the wire stretcher, my hands going numb past feeling in the cold, and it was easier out there, working, than it would have been sitting in that too quiet kitchen, not thinking about a woman on a gray mule, riding toward a job in Millbrook that might or might not still be waiting for her. Because that's the thing nobody tells you about hope. It doesn't announce itself polite and ask permission to move in. It just shows up one morning riding a mule you've never seen before, and by the time you notice it's taken up residence in your chest, It's already rearranged the furniture, and you're standing out in December cold pulling wire, tight with hands you can't feel, thinking about whether a woman 4 days gone might turn her mule around and come back, which was foolish. I told myself that plain, more than once, out loud even, alone on that fence line where nobody but the horses could hear a grown man arguing with himself. Foolish to build anything on 9 days and a handful of suppers. Foolish to let a stranger's certainty about you undo 3 years of your own certainty about yourself. Except she hadn't felt like a stranger by the 4th day, hadn't felt like one at all. My father used to say a man's judgment about himself goes soft after enough years alone, same as an unused muscle goes soft, and you can't always trust it to lift what it used to lift. He said that to me once, the winter after my mother passed, when he caught me doing something close to what I was doing now. Working a fence line too hard, too long, using the cold to keep from thinking. He never remarried. Died alone in that house 3 miles east, and some part of me had always assumed, without deciding to assume it, that I'd likely do the same. That a man who lost one good woman didn't get handed a second chance at that particular kind of luck. That the arithmetic simply didn't run that way twice in one lifetime. Joe would have had something sharp to say about that arithmetic, I expect. Something about how a man convinced of his own bad luck spends so long braced against it, he stops noticing when the winds finally turned. I pulled wire and didn't let myself finish that thought all the way through. Some thoughts a man's not ready to stand fully inside of, yet, even alone on his own land with nobody watching. It was on the second of those 2 days, hauling a fresh coil of wire up from the shed toward the lower gate, that I saw a rider coming down the eastern road. Not Joe. Wrong direction entire. Wrong horse besides a big bay gelding, groomed to a shine that had no business on a working ranch in December, the kind of animal a man buys to be admired rather than ridden hard through weather. I knew that horse before I knew the rider sitting it. I'd seen it tied outside the land office in Millbrook more times than I much cared for. Jonas Vane came up my drive, like he owned the very ground his own horse was walking on, and was only being polite about the rest of the arrangement. He was somewhere near 50, silver gone through at the temples in a way that looked deliberate on him, like even the process of his aging had been arranged beforehand for the best possible effect. A coat too fine for the weather, wool the color of a courthouse wall. He sat that gelding easy, the particular ease of a man who has never once had to work a horse for his living. "Garrett," he said, warm as a man greeting an old friend across a fence post, "heard you had some trouble with the storm. Lost your whole string, they're saying in town." I set the wire coil down slow, didn't answer right away, looked at him instead, and let him feel the weight of being looked at. News travels fast in a small valley, faster than most folks would prefer, I'd imagine. He let his gaze drift past me, out toward the south pasture, where the horses stood grazing loose and easy in the pale afternoon light, and something crossed his face, then quick, gone almost before I caught it, but I would have sworn on my father's Bible it was surprise. Plain surprise. The look of a man whose sum hadn't come out the way his figures had promised, though it looks from here like you got them back after all. I did well, he smiled. It was a fine smile. Practiced, and it stopped well short of his eyes, the way certain smiles always do. That's real good fortune, Garrett. Real good fortune indeed. Something in the particular way he said, fortune sat wrong in my chest, like a burr caught beneath a saddle blanket small, easy enough to ignore for a mile or two, but impossible to forget once you felt it working against the horse's back. "What brings you out this way, Vane?" "Neighborly concern. Mostly, if I'm honest with you." He shifted easy in the saddle. "Heard about the storm and figured a man in your position might be doing some hard thinking about the year ahead. Weather like that. A string scattered, even one you've since gotten back. Praise be, that's a difficult thing on an outfit the size of yours. I only wanted to renew my offer on the land. Fair price. Better than fair, given the circumstances you've been living through of late." "My circumstances changed an hour before you rode up, Vane, when 12 horses walked back into that pasture on their own 4 legs. Of course they did." He held up one gloved hand, easy, placating, the gesture of a man well practiced at smoothing over rough moments. "I only mean to say a man in your position ought to know his options plain, laid out clear in front of him. Times are shifting in this valley, Garrett, faster than most folks around here have yet realized. Better, I'd think, to settle an arrangement on your own terms, while you've still got terms to settle, than to be caught flat-footed later when the ground moves under you, regardless of what you'd prefer." I looked at him a long moment, longer than was strictly comfortable for either one of us. Thought about a fence cut, climbed by a blade, 3 miles distant from anywhere a storm would ever have torn it loose on its own. Thought about how a man who'd offered to buy my land 8 months back and been told no plane to his face happened to ride up the very same week I'd finally found cause to wonder, in earnest, who exactly wanted my horses gone and my resolve worn thin enough to sell cheap. I'll keep my own terms, Vane. Same as I told you back in the spring, and I don't recall the season changing my answer any. Terms. He said the word slow, turning it over like he was testing its weight. You know, Garrett, a man's terms are only as good as the ground they're standing on. I've had my lawyer looking into the old claims filed along this stretch of Willow Creek. Interesting reading, some of it. A great deal of handshake where a man might have wanted paper, going back to your father's day and before. The mention of the water landed exactly where he'd meant it to land, and I made myself keep my face as still as I could manage, though I felt the words go through me same as the cold had gone through my boots. My father's claim is filed proper at the county seat, I said. Same as yours, I'd imagine. Of course it is. He smiled that same fine, hollow smile. I only mean to say, water's a complicated thing in this territory, and complications have a way of costing a man time and money to sort through, even when he's in the right of it. Sometimes more of both than a smaller outfit can readily spare, especially one that's just weathered a hard loss. He gathered his reins. I'd hate to see you spend years and dollars proving what you already know to be true, Garrett, when I'm standing right here offering you a way to walk clear of the whole tangle with money in your pocket instead. I'll take my chances with the county seat over your generosity, Vane. Something flickered behind his eyes then, quick as the surprise had been. Not anger exactly. Calculation. The particular look of a man silently recalculating a sum that had stubbornly refused to come out the way his figures had promised him it would. Suit yourself, of course. He gathered his reins, unhurried. Offer stands through the whole season regardless. Things do change fast out in this country, Garrett. Faster than most men expect, and rarely in the direction they'd have chosen for themselves. He turned the gelding, then paused a beat, looked back over his shoulder at me with that same fine, hollow smile. Glad you got your horses back, all the same. Truly, he rode off unhurried, the particular unhurried of a man with nowhere pressing to be, and a strong wish that you notice he's got nowhere pressing to be, that his time is a thing he can afford to spend loosely on you. I stood in the yard a long while after he'd gone, the wire coil forgotten entirely at my feet, the cold working its slow way up through the soles of my boots and into my bones, because that visit didn't sit right. Not the words he'd chosen, the timing of them, which meant one of two things, and I turned both over slow, weighing them against each other in the fading light. Either Vane had somehow known exactly the right hour to come riding up, looking neighborly and concerned, or he'd known, well before I'd told a single soul in this valley, that something out here had already gone wrong. Until I could set those two possibilities down, beside something more solid than a bad feeling and a burr under a saddle blanket, I had nothing worth carrying to the sheriff. Nothing but a cut fence, a bad taste left in my mouth, and a rich man's smile that never once made it as far as his eyes. So I went back to the wire stretcher, because the work was there waiting, patient, the way work always is. Because it's a far easier thing to pull fence wire tight in the failing light than to sit still with a fear that hasn't yet earned itself a proper name. I worked till full dark came in, told Ezra about the visit while he stood at the stove with his back half to me, stirring a pot that didn't need much stirring. He was quiet a long moment before he answered. Told him no. Same as spring. Good. He said it fast, too fast, same as the morning by the fence, and this time I noticed it plain and couldn't talk myself out of noticing. You've gone quiet on me twice now talking about Vane, I said. Something you want to say, Ezra. Say it. He turned from the stove then, and his face had gone tired in a way I hadn't marked before. Tired past what one headache and one cold day could account for. Nothing to say, he said. Man makes me uneasy is all. Always has. Fellas like that, smiling the way he smiles, you never know what they're counting behind it. I let it lie there. Told myself 11 years of a man's loyalty was worth more than one uneasy pause. Worth more than a headache amply blamed on the cold when the cold hadn't bothered him any other day that whole hard winter. I believed that. Mostly. I believed it the way you believe a fence will hold, because it always has, right up until the morning you find it cut clean through, and have to reckon with everything you'd been too certain of to question. Ate alone at the table after that, Ezra having turned in early. Sat a long while, where 2 cups of coffee had gone cooling between 2 people. 3 evenings running, and now there was only the 1 cup, and only me to drink from it. I told myself I wouldn't wait up listening for the sound of a mule on frozen ground. I told myself that plainly, more than once. And then I sat by the window anyway, longer than any sensible man has business sitting by a window in December, watching a trail that stayed empty the entire while, empty and pale under a rising moon, giving back nothing but the wind moving snow across itself in long, slow drifts. I sat with the window a long while more, long enough that the moon climbed clear of the ridgeline and threw the whole yard into a pale, hard silver, every fence post casting its own thin shadow across the snow. Once near midnight, I thought I heard hooves. Sat up straight in the chair, heart going fast before my mind had caught up enough to tell it not to bother. Went to the door, stood in the cold in my stocking feet, listening hard into a night that gave back nothing but wind, moving through the bare cottonwoods down by the creek, and my own breath, and the particular silence of a valley that holds its secrets close in winter and doesn't give them up easy to a man just because he's asking. No mule, no rider, just snow and moonlight and a fence line 3 miles off that somebody had cut with a blade and let the storm take the blame before I went back inside. Told myself one more time that I wouldn't wait up. Banked the fire low and careful, the way you do when you mean for something to keep burning quiet through a long, uncertain night. Coals held just alive enough to catch again come morning, and I lay in that bed a long while before sleep found me, turning over everything the last 9 days had handed me, all of it tangled together in a way I hadn't sorted out yet and wouldn't, not that night. A woman who'd read this ranch clearer than I had in years, riding toward a job that might or might not want her honesty. A fence cut clean by somebody's own hand, a neighbor with a fine coat and a hollow smile. Riding up the very week I'd started asking questions I couldn't yet answer. A hired man gone quiet in all the wrong places, twice now, over a subject that shouldn't have called for any quiet at all. I didn't know, lying there, which of those threads would matter most before the winter was through. Didn't know that a woman on a mule would ride back into this yard 9 days later carrying more than good news. Didn't know how far Jonas Vane's reach into this valley actually went, or what it would cost the people in it, before the truth of him came fully into the light. I only knew, that night, staring up at a ceiling I'd stared up at 1,000 nights running, that something in the shape of my life had shifted these past 9 days, the way ground shifts before a slide lets go quiet, and slow and impossible to notice until you're already moving. Hope is a hard thing to talk a man out of, once it's found itself a proper foothold in his chest, and mine had found its foothold 9 days back, coming around a bend in the trail on the back of an ugly gray mule, saying 2 words that undid 3 days of a man deciding, in his bones, that everything he'd built was finished. These yours. I fell asleep finally, not knowing whether the next sound on that trail would be a mule coming home with good news, carried careful in a woman's saddlebag, or something else entirely. Something with Jonas Vane's fine coat and hollow smile behind it, already moving, already counting, already certain that a man alone, however stubborn, however steadfast, could still be worn down to nothing if you were patient enough, and cold enough, and willing to let a whole valley's winter do the cruelest part of the work for you. Part 2 18 days is a long time to wait on a sound that doesn't come. I want to tell you I filled those days with work and nothing else. That would be the easier version, the version where a man keeps his head down and his hands busy and doesn't spend half his waking hours listening past the wind for hooves that aren't there. That version would be a lie. The truth is I worked, because the work never stopped needing doing, and underneath the work I waited. Every morning. Coming in from the barn, I looked at the trail first and the house second. Couldn't help it. Didn't try very hard to help it, if I'm honest, which by now you know I mean to be, because that's the thing about hope once it's found a place to live in your chest. It doesn't ask permission to stay, it just moves in, rearranges the furniture, and you're left checking a trail 18 mornings running like a fool, like a boy, like a man 33 years old ought to know better than to keep doing. Except I didn't know better, or I did and did it anyway. The colt took his saddle on the 6th day, same as Joe had promised he would. I stood in the round pen with him a long while after, one hand flat on his neck, and thought about her certainty and how right she'd been about nearly everything she'd said in the 5 days I'd known her. The mare's leg, the chestnut's shoulder, the colt's temper, which made it harder, not easier, to sit with the one thing she hadn't promised, whether she'd come back at all. The 7th morning a letter came. Ezra brought it up from Millbrook along with the mail he'd gone in for flour, a length of new rope, a paper of pins I used, and I still bought out of some habit I'd never examined too closely. He set the letter on the kitchen table without a word and went back out to the barn before I'd even broken the seal. I knew the hand on the envelope, Millbrook Trust and Savings. I'd banked there 10 years since my father's day and had never once in that decade received a letter from them that didn't arrive folded around bad news like a knife arrives folded around a threat. I sat down before I opened it. Some instinct told me to, The letter was short. Bank letters mostly are. They don't waste ink on kindness. It said my note, the one against this land, the one I'd carried since the bad stretch 6 years back, the one I'd been paying down slow and steady every season since, had been called. Not renewed at the usual spring terms, called. Full balance due by the 1st of March, or the bank would be forced to proceed against the collateral described therein. The collateral described therein was my ranch, every acre of it. I read that letter 3 times before the words settled in something my mind could hold on to without sliding off, because it made no sense, because I'd never missed a payment, not one, not in 6 years of scraping together every dollar this place could produce to make sure of exactly that. Because a note doesn't get called early on a man current with his payments unless somebody with the standing to call it wants a particular reason to call it. I saddled a horse inside 20 minutes and rode for Millbrook. The ride-in gave me too much time to think, which is never a kindness a man does himself in weather that cold. I thought about Vane riding up my drive not 2 weeks back, talking about time shifting fast in this valley. I thought about handshake and habit, and papers outlasting handshakes, and a woman's voice at my supper table warning me, gentle but plain, that men with money and lawyers didn't wait around forever for smaller men to catch up to the danger they were standing in. I thought this is what she meant, and then I thought, no, stop. You don't know that yet. Don't hang a man for a crime you haven't proven, not even in your own head, not even riding alone where nobody can hear you convict him. Except I couldn't make myself believe the coincidence. A note called early, the same month a neighbor twice offered to buy the land under it. That wasn't coincidence. That was arithmetic, same as everything else in this life, and I'd learned the hard way that arithmetic doesn't lie even when a man badly wants it to. Thomas Ridley ran the bank in Millbrook, had run it since before my father's time. A careful man, gray and stooped, who I'd have called something close to a friend if banking and friendship were ever a comfortable mix. He looked uneasy the second I came through his door. Wouldn't meet my eye at first, which told me plenty before he'd said a single word. Garrett. He stood, offered a hand I shook out of habit more than warmth. I expect you got the letter. I expect you know I did, or you wouldn't look like a man waiting on a dentist. He almost smiled at that. Almost. Sat back down, gestured me into the chair across from him, folded his hands on the desk the way men fold their hands when they're bracing to say something they'd rather not. The note's been sold, Garrett. 3 words. I'd half expected them and they still landed like a fist. Sold to who, I'm not permitted to say exactly. Bank's policy on Ridley. I kept my voice level. Took some doing. I've banked here 10 years. My father banked here before me. You're going to sit across that desk and tell me a stranger bought the note out from under my own land and you can't say who. He was quiet a long moment, looked toward the window, toward the street outside, like he was checking whether anybody might be near enough to hear what he says next. I didn't say I couldn't say, he said low. I said I'm not permitted to. There's a difference, and I expect you're sharp enough to hear it. Vane. He didn't answer, didn't need to. His silence sat in that office like a third man taking up its own share of the air. How, I said. How does a note against my land end up in Jonas Vane's hands without my say-so, without so much as a letter asking my leave? Banks sell notes, Garrett. Happens more than folks realize, especially now, with the railroad talk stirring men up who've got capital sitting idle and want it put somewhere it'll grow. A note's just paper to a bank, paper that pays interest. We needed capital of our own this quarter, a bad debt elsewhere ate into our reserves worse than I'd like, and Vane's man came through with an offer for a bundle of notes, yours included, at a price that solved our problem quick and clean. You sold my land to my enemy to solve your problem. I sold your note, Garrett, not your land. There's a difference there too, though I understand it might not feel like much of one to you right now. I sat with that a long while, feeling the whole shape of the trap close slow around me, one piece at a time, the way a trap is built to do. Why call it early? I've never missed a payment. Ridley looked genuinely pained then, the first honest thing his face had done since I'd walked in. Newholder's got the right to set his own terms on collection within reason. Vane's terms call for full balance inside 90 days, or he proceeds. 90 days to raise what I've been paying down slow for 6 years. I know it's a hard ask. It's not a hard ask, Ridley. It's a trap with a fence built around it, and I'm the animal standing inside the fence, wondering how the gate got shut without me hearing it. I stood, didn't shake his hand this time, he didn't offer it. For what it's worth, he said. As I reached the door, I don't like the shape of this any better than you do. Man's been buying up half this valley's paper, the Denton's note, the old coal place, before they sold up and left rather than fight it. Yours is just the newest. I stood with my hand still on the door a moment, turning that over. Denton's note too, called 8 months back. Settled quiet, I expect. That's why you never heard word of it. Denton's a proud man. Wouldn't have wanted the valley knowing he'd folded to pressure instead of choosing to sell outright. Ridley's face had gone tired in the telling. Tired in a way that told me this wasn't the first time the weight of it had sat on him uneasy. That's likely why they stopped buying stock from you 2 years back, if I had to guess at something you haven't asked me to guess at. Man doesn't want to look too close at a neighbor's troubles when he's got the same wolf circling his own gate. That landed harder than I expected it to. 2 years I'd carried the sting of Denton's silence, as some judgment on my own bad luck, some tally the valley had quietly kept against me, and it had never been about me at all. It had been about a man too proud, or too frightened, to admit he was drowning in the very same water. I stopped with my hand on the door. You knew this, and you sold to him anyway. Not a charity. I've got depositors of my own to answer to. A pause. I'm sorry. For whatever a banker's sorry is worth to a man about to lose his land. I rode home slower than I'd ridden in, because there was no longer any particular reason to hurry toward bad news. I already had firm in my hand. 90 days. March 1st. I did the arithmetic the whole ride back, and it ran exactly as badly as I'd known it would before I'd even started running the numbers. There was no version of this ranch's income, not even a good spring sale of every foal we'd bring, not even selling stock I couldn't afford to sell, that added up to the full balance of that note inside 90 days. Not without help. Not without something I didn't yet have, and couldn't yet see the shape of, which meant Vane hadn't bought a note. He'd bought a clock, and he'd started it running the same week he'd stood in my yard with a hollow smile, talking about times shifting fast in this valley. I told Ezra that evening at the table, because there wasn't any sense keeping it from him now. He went pale hearing it, paler than the news alone seemed to account for, and his hands were unsteady setting his cup down. 90 days, he said half to himself. 90 days. Garrett, he stopped, started again. There's got to be something can be done. Lawyer, maybe. Somebody who knows the paper better than either of us. Maybe. I looked at him a long moment. The same uneasy pause I'd caught in him twice, already sitting there again, plain as day, in the lamplight. You're taking this hard for a hired hand. I've worked this place 11 years, Garrett. It's not nothing to me either. I let it lie. Told myself again that 11 years of loyalty ought to count for more than an uneasy look across a supper table. I believed that, mostly, but I noticed, and this time the noticing didn't fade by morning. I didn't learn what happened to Joe in Millbrook until she told me herself. Days later, sitting across this same table, with a mule blown from hard riding and a look in her eye I hadn't seen on her before. But I've turned her account over in my mind so many times since that I could tell it to you now, like I'd stood in the room myself, watching it happen. She rode into Millbrook on the 5th day out from my ranch, later than she'd planned on account of the second storm, cold, clear, through and saddle sore, in a way she told me she'd stopped noticing somewhere around day 20 of the original ride up from Texas. The town sat in a shallow bowl of the valley, maybe 40 buildings strung along one main street, smoke rising from every chimney against a sky gone the color of old pewter. She noticed the sheriff's office first. She told me, a low building near the street's end, with a stove that threw more smoke than heat, and a man sitting inside it with his boots up, who watched her ride past with the particular, lazy attention of someone cataloging a stranger without any real intention of doing anything useful with the information. Tolliver, though she didn't know his name yet, didn't so much as nod as she passed. Just watched, the way a man watches weather he doesn't expect to have to do anything about. She noticed the land office too, 2 doors down from the bank. A good deal finer than a town this size seemed to warrant real glass in the windows. Gold lettering on the door reading Vane Land and Cattle Co., the paint fresh enough that she could smell it faintly even from the street. She didn't think much of it that first afternoon, she told me. Just filed it away, the way she filed most things away, without yet understanding it would matter. She rode straight to the address she'd carried, folded in her coat pocket, the whole 29 days from Texas. Hale's Dry Goods sat on the main street, a narrow storefront with good glass windows, and a sign painted careful, the kind of place that wanted badly to look more prosperous than its ledgers likely allowed. Constance Hale ran it, a widow near 50, sharp-eyed, quick with a smile that didn't always reach past her mouth any more than Vane's did, though for entirely different reasons Joe would come to understand. Mrs. Hale had written to a cousin back in St. Louis, looking for a woman who could keep books and wasn't afraid of long hours, and the cousin had passed the letter along the chain of women traveling west that season, and that was how Joe's name had ended up in Mrs. Hale's careful, hopeful hand. The first morning went well enough. Joe told me that plain, no bitterness in the telling, just fact. Mrs. Hale showed her the store, the stockroom, the small room in back where Joe would sleep. Showed her the ledgers, too, stacked 3 years deep and messier than they had any business being for a store this size. Joe spent 4 hours with those books the first afternoon. Didn't say much while she worked, just made notes, careful, the same way she'd have read A Horse's Stride for Trouble before saying a word about it out loud. By evening, she had a fair picture of what was actually wrong. Over-ordering on goods that sat too long on the shelf. Credit extended too loose to customers who'd shown no sign of paying it back inside a reasonable season. A supplier in Cheyenne charging Mrs. Hale a good deal more than the going rate, on account of nobody had ever sat down and questioned the invoices close enough to catch it. I can see what's wrong, Joe told her, that first evening, laying it out plain the way she laid most things out. I can fix a good deal of it if you'll let me. Mrs. Hale's face did something complicated then, said. Something between gratitude and fear, like a woman glad to hear the diagnosis and terrified all the same of what the cure might cost her pride. I don't need it fixed loud, Mrs. Hale said. I need the numbers to come out right at the end of the month. That's all. I don't need you telling me what I've done wrong these 3 years. I need you writing it down quiet and making it work. Joe told me later that was the moment she understood the shape of the job she'd actually signed on for, as opposed to the one she'd imagined writing 29 days to reach. Not a partner, not a woman whose eye and whose judgment would be trusted and used and credited. A clerk, a quiet pair of hands to make the numbers behave without ever once being asked what she thought the numbers meant. I've kept books 7 years. Joe said to her, careful, trying the door once more before deciding it was well and truly shut. I don't just write numbers down. I understand what they're telling a person, if that person's willing to hear it. I'm sure you do. Mrs. Hale's voice had gone thin-tight. But I didn't ask for understanding, Miss Larkin. I asked for quiet. Joe took the job anyway. Told me that plain too. No shame in the admission. A person 29 days from anywhere else doesn't always have the luxury of walking off a job the first evening on principle alone, however much the principle stings. She worked 3 days, kept the books quiet, same as she'd been told to. Watched Mrs. Hale's shoulders unclench like a little more each evening as the numbers, slow, began behaving. It was the 4th evening, walking back from the mercantile with a package under her arm, that she heard Vane's voice through the open door of the land office. She told me she almost kept walking. Almost. Except something in the particular tone of it, low, careful, the tone of men discussing something they didn't, especially want carrying out into the street, made her slow her steps instead, and then stop entirely, just past the window, in the blue shadow. The building threw across the boardwalk at that hour. 2 voices. Vane's and another she didn't know, rougher, a voice used to being outdoors more than indoors. Denton's close to folding, the rough voice was saying, another season like the last 2 and he'll sign whatever you put in front of him. Denton's not the concern. Vane's voice unhurried, the same unhurried I'd heard in my own yard. Denton was always going to fold on his own timeline. The Shaw place is the one holding up the whole northern boundary of what I need settled before the survey crews come through in spring. Joe went very still, she told me. Still enough that a passing wagon nearly ran the wheel up onto the boardwalk where she stood, and she barely noticed it happening. Shaw's stubborn, the rough voice said. Man like that doesn't fold easy, even with the note called. Everyone folds, given the right pressure applied at the right point. A pause, and Joe said she could hear, even through a wall, the particular satisfaction in it, the voice of a man who'd solved a difficult sum and was pleased with his own cleverness. The storm handled the first pressure well enough, cost him nearly everything. Would have finished it if that drifter hadn't found his horses and dragged them back. Fortunate for him. Unfortunate for our timeline. The note ought to finish what the storm didn't manage. 90 days is generous. Most men can't raise that kind of capital in 90 days on a ranch that size, however hard they work at it. And if he does raise it, then we find another pressure point. There's always another one, if a man's patient enough to look. That's the whole art of it. Papers rustling, the particular sound of documents being gathered and set aside. I want the water rights filing finalized before the thaw. Everything downstream of the Shaw place needs to run through my hands. On paper, clean and legal, before anybody thinks to question the arrangement your father's generation left as handshake instead of deed. Joe stood in that blue shadow a long while, after the voices moved on to some other matter, some smaller piece of business that didn't concern my land at all. Stood there long enough that the package under her arm had gone cold against her side, and her own breath had started fogging visible in the evening air, and she had to make herself walk on before somebody noticed a woman standing motionless outside a lit window for longer than any errand could explain. She didn't sleep that night, told me that plain too. Lay in the small back room at Hale's, staring at a ceiling she didn't know, running the whole conversation over and over, trying to decide what to do with what she'd heard. She could have written a letter, could have waited for a safer, slower way to pass the warning along. Any sensible person, she said, weighing it careful in the dark, might have chosen the safer road. She wasn't feeling especially sensible that night. By first light, she'd packed her bag, told Mrs. Hale plain and without apology that she'd be leaving, and was on Ulysses's back and moving before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. Mrs. Hale hadn't taken the news well. Joe told me that part quick, without much weight on it, like it mattered less to her than nearly everything else she'd overheard the evening before. Said something about ingratitude, about women these days not knowing the value of steady work when they found it. Joe hadn't argued the point, hadn't had the patience left in her for it, not with what she was carrying back toward my ranch. Just 9 days it took her, riding hard, stopping only when Ulysses's legs demanded it, and not 1 hour longer. 9 days of turning the whole conversation over. She told me, trying to build it into something more than just a warning, trying to build it into a plan, because a warning alone wasn't going to save a ranch from a note called in 90 days. A warning told a man what was coming. It didn't tell him how to survive it. So somewhere on that hard 9-day ride, cold and half-starved and sleeping rough more nights than not, Josephine Larkin started doing arithmetic of her own. Different arithmetic than mine. Arithmetic built not on what was lost, but on what might still be saved. If a person looked at it clear enough and long enough, he could, and refused to look away from the parts that hurt worse to examine. While all that was happening 2 days' ride from my own gate, I was living through something considerably smaller and considerably stranger, right here on my own land. It started with the grain. Ezra kept the feed accounts, same as he'd kept them 11 years, and I'd never once had cause to look over his shoulder while he did it. Trust builds up slow, between two men working the same hard ground that many seasons. You stop checking a thing once you've watched it done right 1,000 times running. But the note had put a different kind of attention in me, sharpened it, made me look at every corner of this operation, with the particular hard focus of a man who knows now that 90 days stand between him and losing the whole of it. So I checked the feed ledger, found 2 entries I couldn't square with what sat in the storehouse. Not large amounts. Small enough that a careless man might have missed them entirely, might have chalked the difference up to spoilage or waste or simple bad counting. I wasn't feeling careless anymore. I asked Ezra about it plain, over supper, keeping my voice even the way you keep your voice, even around a spooked animal. 2 sacks short of what the ledger shows purchased, I said. You know anything about that? He went still, just for a second. Long enough that I caught it, same as I'd caught the pauses before. Might have miscounted, he said. I'll check the storehouse again tomorrow. Might have. Garrett, I've kept these books 11 years without you asking me twice about a single figure. I'd think that'd count for something. Even now, it does count for something. I held his eye across the lamplight and for once didn't let him look away first, which is exactly why I'm asking plain instead of asking around. Give me the truth, Ezra, whatever it is. I've got 90 days to save this place and I can't afford surprises I didn't see coming. He looked at his plate a long while. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough in a way I hadn't heard from him before. Not in 11 years, not even the winter his first wife had passed. There's nothing to it but bad counting, he said. I'll fix the figures tomorrow. I let it go. Told myself one more time that a man doesn't throw away 11 years of loyalty over 2 sacks of grain and a handful of uneasy pauses. Told myself the note had me seeing shadows where there weren't any. Same as grief had made me set 2 coffee cups down some mornings for a woman who wasn't coming back to drink from the second one. I was wrong to let it go. I know that now. I didn't know it then, and there's a particular cruelty in hindsight that I won't pretend doesn't still visit me some nights. Turning that supper conversation over, wondering what might have gone different if I'd pushed harder in that one moment, instead of choosing, out of 11 years of habit, to trust a friend over my own sharpening instincts. The days without Joe stretched longer than 18 days has any right to feel. I kept the ranch running, kept the colts training up, slow and careful, same as she'd shown me that first week. Rode the boundary twice more, found no fresh damage, though I couldn't shake the sense the whole time of being watched from somewhere I couldn't quite place. On the 12th day, I rode to see Sheriff Tolliver about the cut fence, finally, having put it off longer than I should have, out of some stubborn hope I'd find the answer myself before I had to hand the problem to a man in a badge. Tolliver's office sat at the end of Millbrook's Main Street, a small building with a stove that never seemed to throw enough heat for the size of the room. He heard me out, or made the motions of hearing me out, leaning back in his chair with his boots up on the corner of his desk the whole while. Cut fence? he said when I'd finished. Could have been anybody, Garrett. Drifter looking to steal stock and spooked off before he finished the job. Kids from one of the outlying places, up to mischief they didn't think through. 3 miles from the nearest neighbor's kids in a blizzard with a blade sharp enough to cut clean through 3 strands in one pass. Strange things happen in strange weather. He didn't meet my eye saying it. Same as Ridley hadn't met my eye at the bank, and I was starting to recognize the particular shape that look took on a man in this valley lately. You going to look into it at all, Sheriff? Or is that your whole investigation, sitting right there with your boots up? Something flickered across his face, quick gone before I could name it for certain. I'll ask around, he said, in the tone of a man who had no intention of asking anybody anything. Can't promise much without more to go on than a cut wire and a bad feeling, Garrett. You understand how these things work. I understood exactly how these things worked. By the time I rode home that evening, understood it better than I wanted to. A banker who wouldn't say a name out loud. A sheriff who wouldn't lift a boot off his own desk. A hired man gone quiet in all the wrong places. Every thread I pulled it led back, sooner or later, to the same fine coat and the same hollow smile, and I was starting to understand that a man like Vane didn't need to break the law himself when he could simply arrange for the people paid to enforce it to look the other way on his behalf. It was the 18th evening, near dusk, with the light gone the particular gray-gold color it takes on, right before full dark in December, that I heard Ulysses on the trail. I was in the barn, and I dropped what I was holding. I couldn't tell you now what it was. Some tool or other. Gone from memory the second I heard those hooves, and was out the door and standing in the yard before I had fully decided to move at all. She came around the bend the same way she had the first time, though everything else about the moment was different. No 12 horses trailing behind her this time. Just Ulysses, blown hard from the ride, and Joe herself, dust and cold weather worn deep into her face, eyes tired in a way that told me plain she hadn't slept much these last 9 days. She pulled up in the yard, looked at me, and for a moment neither one of us said anything at all. The whole 18 days of waiting sitting there between us, too large for either of us to know quite where to set it down first. Door was smaller than she made it sound in her letters, Joe said finally. It wasn't what either of us meant to say first. I understood that even as she said it, but it was a door and we both needed a door to walk through before we could get to the room that actually mattered. That's often the way with letters, I said. The books were a mess. I fixed what I could in 3 days. She didn't want the diagnosis, only the cure, and I'm not built for handing over a cure without explaining what it's curing. She swung down off Ulysses, slow, her whole body moving with the particular stiffness of someone who spent too many hours in a saddle with too little rest between. It wasn't the job I thought I'd signed on for. What was it then? A job for a quiet woman who could make numbers behave without ever being asked what the numbers meant. She looked at me straight, that same read she'd given me the very first day. Though something in it had changed, hardened maybe, or settled into a shape it hadn't fully found before. I've been quiet long enough, Garrett. I'm done applying for jobs that want me smaller than I am. I took Ulysses's reins from her, more to have something to do with my hands than out of any real necessity. You rode 9 days to tell me that. I rode 9 days. She said, because I overheard something in Millbrook I couldn't leave unspoken, and because once I'd started riding, I found I didn't much want to stop before I reached you. I went still at that. Whole world went still, or my particular corner of it did. What'd you overhear? She told me. Standing right there in the yard, cold coming down hard around us, Ulysses steaming where he stood, she told me the whole of it. Vane's voice through that office window, the Shaw place holding up his whole northern boundary, the note called as pressure, and the water rights filing meant to follow behind it clean and legal, before anybody thought to question. A handshake 3 generations old. I told her about the note, about Ridley's careful, unhappy face, and the 90 days, and the arithmetic that wouldn't run right, no matter how many times I turned it over. She listened to all of it, without once interrupting, the way she listened to everything, and when I'd finished she was quiet a long moment, working something over behind those steady eyes. 90 days isn't nothing, she said finally. It's not enough time to build a fortune from scratch, but it might be enough time to stop bleeding money. You don't need to be bleeding if a person looked hard enough at where it's running out. You rode 9 days hard on top of 9 days you'd already spent, and you want to talk ledgers before you've even had supper. I want to talk ledgers, she said, because ledgers are the one part of this whole mess I actually know how to fight. Everything else Vane, the sheriff, the water rights, that's bigger than either one of us tonight, standing here half frozen in your yard. But your books. Your books I can do something about, starting tonight if you'll let me. I looked at her a long moment, thought about 18 days of an empty trail, and a note calling my whole life due in 90, and a woman who'd ridden herself half to ruin to bring me back, not comfort, not soft words, but a plan. Come inside, I said. Ezra's got supper on, and bring your ledger eyes, Miss Larkin. God knows this ranch could use them. She spent 3 evenings at that table after her return, same as she had before, the ledger open and a pencil going, and her whole attention narrowed down to columns of figures, the way it had narrowed down to a colt's temperament that first week. I sat across from her most of those hours, watching her work, half doing my own chores and half simply watching, because there was something in the particular quality of her focus that I found I didn't much want to look away from. On the 3rd evening she turned the paper around so I could read it. 3 things, she said. Same as before. Feed costs are running high because you're still buying from Whitmore in town, instead of contracting direct with the grain operation, out past Denton's place, that's costing you near 20% more than it needs to, across a full season. Breeding fees you're charging are under what the market will bear, which I'd guess is old habit more than anything. Pricing yourself the way you priced things back, when the string was smaller and you were still building a reputation you don't need to keep building anymore. And there's 2 mares here you've been planning to sell come spring open. Sell them in foal instead, even accounting for the extra feed through summer, and you'll net near double. 3 things, I said, and none of it gets me a full 90-day balance sitting in the bank by March. No, she agreed, plain, no softening in it. It doesn't, not on its own. But it buys you room, Garrett, room to breathe while we figure out the rest. A man drowning doesn't need the whole ocean solved at once. He needs enough air in his lungs to keep swimming toward shore. I sat with that a long while, looked at the 3 lines she'd written out clean, the numbers beside each one, and felt something in my chest loosen that had been clenched tight since the morning Ridley's letter arrived. Why, I said, finally. Why ride 9 days hard, twice over, for a ranch that isn't yours, a note that isn't yours to worry over? She set her pencil down, looked at me a long moment in the lamplight, the same straight red she'd given me from the very first morning, though there was something new sitting underneath it now. Something she hadn't let show quite this plain before. Because I spent 5 days here in December, she said, watching a man fix 3 things nobody asked him to fix, and read a mare's leg true before anybody told him what to look for. And I decided something about you that I haven't had cause to change my mind on since. Some things a person decides slow, over careful watching. This wasn't one of them. This I decided quick, and I've never once been sorry for deciding quick when the deciding turned out true. Neither one of us said anything else for a while after that. Didn't need to. The lamp burned low between us, and outside the wind moved snow across itself in the dark. And I understood, sitting there, that whatever this was building toward, it had already gone past anything either one of us could talk our way back out of, even if either one of us had wanted to, which I was fairly certain by then that neither of us did. I started the new grain contract inside the week. Rode out past Denton's place myself to speak with the operation Joe had pointed me toward, and came home with terms good enough that I sat in the wagon a long moment before driving on, just doing the arithmetic over again to make sure I hadn't misheard the numbers. I hadn't. 20%, same as she'd said, maybe a hair better once I'd finished haggling. Small things, she'd called it. Room to breathe. But a man who's been drowning learns quick not to mind the size of the air he's given, so long as it's air. There were lighter evenings in those weeks, too. I want that said plain, because a person hearing only the note and the sabotage and the sheriff's boots up on his desk might come away thinking those weeks held nothing but dread, and that wouldn't be honest telling. Joe took over the cooking most nights by then, not because I'd asked her to, but because she'd apparently decided somewhere along the way that my one recipe of salt pork and cornbread was an insult to the 3 hens and the well-stocked cold box both. I came in one evening to find her elbow deep in a stew that smelled better than anything that kitchen had produced since Eliza's day, and made the mistake of saying so out loud. Careful, she said, not turning from the stove. A man compares a woman's cooking to his dead wife's. He'd best mean it as the highest compliment he owns, because there's no recovering if he didn't. I meant it as the highest compliment I own. Good. Pause, stirring. Because I wasn't finished being flattered by it. I laughed, and she nearly smiled, which by then I'd learned to count as a considerable victory. You going to tell me where a panhandle cowhand learned to cook like this, I said, or is that a secret same as everything else about you seems to be? No secret. Woman on the outfit I worked cook for 40 hands. Twice a day. Every day. 6 years running. I watched her enough evenings I picked up more than I meant to. She tasted the stew off the wooden spoon, adjusted something, with a pinch of salt from the tin. She used to say a person could tell everything worth knowing about a ranch by what came out of its kitchen. Careless outfit, careless food. Outfit that cared about its people. You could taste it in the gravy. What's my gravy telling you then, before you fixed it? That you'd been surviving instead of living. Same as everything else about this place before I rode up. She looked at me sideways. That particular look I was starting to recognize meant she was about to say something she found more amusing than she was letting her face show. Man can survive a long while on salt pork and stubbornness, Garrett Shaw. Doesn't mean he ought to keep doing it. Once better sitting right there in his own cold box waiting on somebody to notice it. That a comment about the ham, or about something else entirely. Could be either. She turned back to the stove, the corner of her mouth doing something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not one either. Depends on how quick you catch my meaning. I caught her meaning. Took me a moment longer than it should have, standing there in that kitchen, with the stew smell filling up a house that had gone too long without a smell like that in it. But I caught it. Joe, I've been meaning to say something to you. Been meaning to for near 2 weeks now, and keep losing my nerve to it every time the moment comes close. She set the spoon down, turned to face me full on, and whatever teasing had been in her face a moment before had gone quiet, replaced by something steadier, more careful. Say it then, she said. I've never much cared for a man who circles a thing instead of riding straight at it. I opened my mouth to do exactly that, and Ezra's boots hit the porch step outside, loud, hurried, and whatever I'd been about to say went clean out of my head as he came through the door hollering that one of the mares had gotten herself tangled in the paddock fence and needed hands fast. We were both out the door inside 10 seconds. The moment scattered. Same as the mares had been scattered that first storm, and by the time the mare was freed and settled, and the excitement had passed, full dark had come down, and the particular courage that moment had required seemed to have gone with it. Later, Joe said, catching my eye across the yard, once the mare was calm again, like she'd read the whole disappointment plain on my face, and wanted me to know she felt the same missing of it. Whatever you were going to say, it'll keep. Will it? Most things worth saying keep just fine, she said, so long as the two people who need to hear them don't go anywhere in the meantime. A pause, and something almost gentle came into her voice. I'm not going anywhere, Garrett. Not with a note hanging over this place and a man like Vane circling it. Wouldn't be much of a person if I rode off now, would I? Right when the fights actually started to matter. I held on to that the rest of that evening, and the days that followed it, the way a man holds on to a promise made plain, even when the moment that should have followed it got interrupted before it properly began. Later she'd said, and I believed her the same easy way I'd come to believe most things she told me plain, because by then I'd learned she didn't say things she didn't mean, not even small things, not even a single word like later, tossed off in a cold yard with a spooked mare still blowing hard behind her. It was 11 nights after her return, cold clear through, moon near full and throwing hard silver light across the whole yard, that I woke to a sound I knew before I was fully awake to know it. Dogs barking down at the Denton place, faint, carried on the wind, and under that closer, a sound from my own barn that didn't belong there at that hour. I was out of bed and pulling boots on before I'd finished deciding to move. Joe was awake too. I heard her door open across the hall the same moment mine did, and she was dressed and moving beside me before either of us had said a word, the two of us understanding the shape of the night without needing to discuss it. We came around the side of the barn together, quiet, and I saw a shape at the near gate, the gate to the small paddock where I'd been keeping the 2 mares. Joe had told me to hold back and breed instead of sell. The shape had it open, was standing there in the moonlight with a hand on the latch, and the mares already shifting uneasy behind him, sensing something wrong in the night, the way animals always do before people catch up to the same understanding. Hold, I called out, sharper than I meant to. The shape turned, and in the hard silver moonlight, plain as anything, I saw Ezra Combs standing at that gate with his hand still on the latch and a look on his face I will carry the rest of my life. Not the look of a stranger caught in wrongdoing. The look of a man who has been dreading a particular moment for so long that its arrival comes almost as a relief, terrible as it is, simply because the waiting is finally over. Ezra. His name came out of me rough, disbelieving, even though some part of me, the part that had noticed every pause, every too fast answer, every headache blamed on cold that hadn't bothered him any other day, had been building toward this exact moment for weeks, without letting the rest of me know it. He didn't run. I want that said plain, because it matters, I think, to what came after. He could have run, had the whole dark valley to disappear into, A horse tied not 30 feet off in the shadow of the tree line. He didn't move at all. Just stood there with his hand still on the latch, head bowed, like a man waiting on a sentence he'd already passed on himself long before I arrived to pass it formally. "Garrett," he said. His voice had gone to almost nothing. "I can explain." Then explain. I heard my own voice shaking and didn't try to steady it, because right now I'm standing in my own yard watching a man I trusted 11 years open a gate at midnight, for reasons that don't have one honest shape I can imagine. Joe had gone to the mare's calm quiet, checking they hadn't been spooked into the kind of run that could hurt them in the dark and the cold. She didn't say anything, just worked, giving Ezra and me the room the moment needed, though I could feel her listening to every word same as I was. "It's Martha," Ezra said finally. His wife's name came out of him like it cost him something physical to say it. "You know she's been poorly since the fall. I know she's had a cough. Didn't know it was." I stopped. Made myself slow down, made myself actually hear what he was trying to tell me instead of running ahead of it toward my own anger. All of it. Doctor in Millbrook says it's her lungs. Consumption maybe, though he wasn't certain enough to say the word outright the first visit. Said she needed rest, and better food than we could regular afford, and a tonic that costs more than a month of my wages here. Every month, for as long as she needs it. He looked up at me then, finally, and his face in that hard moonlight had gone old in a way I hadn't marked before. Years older than the 51 I knew him to be. "I didn't have the money, Garrett. Went to the bank first. Ridley turned me down flat, said my wages here weren't collateral enough for what I was asking. I didn't know where else to turn. And Vane turned up with an answer. Vane's man did. Fella named Coyle. Works for him doing the parts of his business he doesn't want his own name attached to. Found me in Millbrook, bought me a drink I didn't ask for, and by the end of the evening I'd signed a note I understood maybe half of, for money enough to keep Martha in tonic and good food through the winter." His voice cracked on the last of it. I told myself I'd pay it back honest, working extra where I could. Then Coyle came around again, month later, and said the terms had changed. Said Mr. Vane was willing to forgive the whole debt, wipe it clean if I did him one small favor. "Cut my fence. Cut your fence." He said it like the words themselves were a confession heavier than anything that had come before them. "I want you to understand, Garrett. I didn't do it easy. Sat with it 3 days before I could make myself go out there with the blade. Told myself it was just a fence. Told myself the horses would likely stay close even scattered, that the damage wouldn't run as deep as it did. I was wrong about that, same as I've been wrong about near everything since. That storm hit harder than either of us could have guessed, and your whole string nearly paid for my mistake with their lives. And I've carried that knowing every single day since, Garrett, whether you believe it or not. And tonight Coyle came around again. Said the note's called. Said Vane wants to make sure the pressure holds. Wants something more this time. Wanted me to run those 2 mares off, the 2 you've been planning to breed instead of sell. Said if the ranch looked worse off heading toward March, you'd be that much more likely to fold quiet, instead of fighting the note in court, where things could get slower and more expensive for everybody involved, Vane included. He shook his head slow, and something in his face crumbled that I hadn't ever seen crumble on him before, not at his first wife's funeral, not through any hard winter we'd weathered together in 11 years. "I couldn't do it, Garrett. Had my hand right there on the latch, and I couldn't make myself finish it, not this time. I've been standing here I don't know how long, arguing with myself in the dark, when you came around that corner. The yard went quiet a long while after that, just went, and the mares settling slow under steady hands, and the particular ringing silence that follows a confession too large for either man in it to know quite what to do with right away. "You should have come to me," I said finally. "The first time Coyle found you, you should have come straight to me instead of carrying it alone." And said what, Garrett? That I'd taken money from the man trying to steal your land to save my own wife's life? You'd have fired me on the spot, and rightly so, and I'd have had nothing left to give Martha at all. I was trying to protect her, the only way I could see clear to protect her. Doesn't make it right. I know it doesn't make it right, but it's the truth of why, and you asked for the truth. So there it is, whole and ugly as it is. I looked at him a long while in that moonlight, thought about 11 years of a man's loyalty, and 1 winter of a man's desperation, and how those 2 things could sit true in the same chest at the same time without canceling each other out clean the way I might have wanted them to. Standing there angry and betrayed and cold clear through. Thought about my father, too, somewhere in the back of my mind, and the particular thing he used to say about judging a man only by his worst hour, never once by the 1,000 better hours that came before it. I hadn't understood that saying fully until I was standing in my own yard at midnight, needing badly to understand it. "Go inside," I said finally. Both of us are half frozen, and neither one of us is thinking clear enough tonight to decide anything that matters. We'll talk in the morning, with full light on it, and figure out what happens next." He looked at me like he hadn't expected that, like he'd braced himself the whole walk out to that gate for something considerably harder than a night's postponement. "Garrett, I'm mourning Ezra." I kept my voice even, though even was costing me plenty by then. "Go check on Martha. I expect she's wondering where you've gotten to." He went, walked to his horse slow, mounted slower, rode off toward Millbrook without once looking back, and I stood in that yard a long while, after the sound of his horse had faded, same as I'd stood there 18 days running, after Joe first rode out toward a job that hadn't wanted her honesty either. Joe came and stood beside me once the mares had settled proper. Didn't say anything at first, just stood, the way she had a talent for standing beside a person exactly as long as the moment called for and not 1 second longer. "You're not going to hand him to the sheriff," she said finally. "Not quite a question. Tollivers has already told me plain he's not interested in looking too hard at anything connected to Vane. Handing Ezra over would likely just cost a desperate man his freedom and his wife her nurse, without slowing Vane down one single day. That's not the only reason, though." I thought about that a long moment, honest with myself before I answered her. "Honest, no," I admitted. "It's not. 11 years is 11 years, Joe. A man doesn't throw that away over one winter of a different man's desperation. However much damage it did, doesn't mean I'm not angry. Doesn't mean I trust him again easy, or soon. But there's a difference between a man who did wrong and a man who is wrong, clear through, and I've known Ezra Combs long enough to know which one I'm standing across from tonight." Joe was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again her voice had gone soft, in a way I hadn't heard from her yet, soft the way steel goes soft only right at the very edge, before it finds its temper again. "My father used to say something close to that," she said, "about judging the whole of a man by his frost hour. I didn't understand it fully till just now, watching you choose not to." She looked at me in the moonlight, and whatever had been building between us these past weeks seemed, in that particular cold, quiet moment, to settle into something neither one of us needed to name out loud yet, though we both understood plain enough that it had settled regardless. Vane's made a mistake, though, using a man's love for his sick wife as a lever. That's the kind of mistake that comes back on a person sooner or later. Cruelty like that doesn't stay hidden forever, not in a valley this size. "No," I agreed, looking out past her toward the dark ridgeline where Vane spread, sat somewhere beyond my sight, patient, certain, counting down 90 days he believed wrongly that I had no way to survive. "It doesn't, and I intend to be standing right here, on my own land, when it comes back on him." We went inside together, into a house gone cold with the door left open too long, and I banked the fire low, same as I had every uncertain night since this all began, not knowing then what the coming weeks would ask of either one of us, only knowing, with a certainty that had nothing to do with arithmetic at all, that whatever came next, I wasn't facing it alone anymore. Not the note, not Vane, not even Ezra's slow, hard road back toward whatever trust could still be rebuilt between two men who'd weathered 11 good years and one very bad winter together. Somewhere out past the ridge, I knew Jonas Vane was sleeping easy in a fine house, certain his arithmetic was running exactly the way he'd planned it. He didn't know yet that his own hired man had broken at the gate instead of finishing the job. Didn't know a woman with a ledger and a straight, unflinching read on people had ridden 18 hard days round trip to bring back a warning and a plan both. Didn't know yet that the valley he meant to fold quiet under his own patient pressure had a few people left in it who intended to fold for nobody. March 1st was coming regardless. The note would come due whether we were ready or not. But for the first time since Ridley's letter had landed on my kitchen table, I went to sleep that night actually believing, that 90 days might be enough after all, not because the arithmetic had changed, but because I was no longer the only one doing the sum. I lay awake a while before sleep finally took me, listening to the particular quiet of a house, with 3 people breathing under its roof instead of 2, thinking about everything the last weeks had handed me, tangled together in a way I hadn't fully sorted and wouldn't, not that night. A note called early by a man patient enough to wait 90 days for it to finish his work. A hired hand's 11 years of loyalty, cracked but not broken by one hard winter and a sick wife's cough. A woman who'd ridden 18 days round trip, carrying nothing heavier than a warning and a plan, and had somehow, in the carrying of it, become the steadiest ground I had left to stand on. Somewhere out past the ridge, Jonas Vane slept easy in his fine house, believing his arithmetic was running exactly as he'd designed it to run. He didn't know yet how much of that arithmetic had already started coming apart at the seams, A hired man who'd broken at the gate instead of finishing the job. A woman who'd carried his own words back to the very man he meant them to ruin. A sheriff's unwillingness to look too hard already noted and filed away by two people who'd expecting the law in this valley to save them and had started building, instead, towards saving themselves. 90 days. I turned the number over one last time before sleep finally came, and for once it didn't run quite so badly as it had the morning Ridley's letter first arrived. Not because the debt had shrunk, because I'd stopped standing alone in the arithmetic of it. Part 3. Ezra came back at first light, same as he'd said he would, and stood in my yard with his hat in both hands, like a man, reporting for a sentence he'd already accepted before I'd handed it down. I hadn't slept much myself. Lay awake a long while after Joe and I finally went back inside, turning the whole thing over 11 years against one winter, loyalty against desperation, and the particular hard question of whether a man could hold both truths in his chest at once, without one canceling the other clean out. My father would have known the answer without needing to sit up half the night working toward it. I was still learning to be the kind of man who knew things without needing the night to teach him first. Martha's resting, he said. Doctor came by in the night. Says the tonic's helping. Some, not cured, helping. Good. I looked at him a long moment in that gray morning light. You're not fired, Ezra. I want that said plain first thing before either of us says another word. Something in his shoulders came loose that had been locked tight since the night before. I don't deserve that, Garrett, maybe not. Doesn't change what I said. I stepped down off the porch. But you're going to help me undo what you helped Vane build, every bit of it. Starting with the truth told plain, to whoever needs to hear it. He nodded slow. Whatever you need. Which is how, 2 days later, the three of us rode into Millbrook together, Ezra, between Joe and me the whole way quiet, looking like a man walking himself toward his own gallows and grateful for the company regardless. Sheriff Tolliver had his boots up on the desk same as always, same stove throwing more smoke than heat, and he didn't so much as sit up straight when we came through the door. Garrett, he said, and company. Ezra's got something to tell you, I said, about the cut fence back in December. I watched Tolliver's face while Ezra talked, watched it stay flat and unmoved clear through the whole confession, the debt, the man named Coyle, Vane's instructions passed along like orders down a chain nobody wanted their fingerprints on. Ezra even offered up the note itself, the paper he'd signed, pulled crumpled from his coat pocket like a man surrendering the last thing he owned. Tolliver looked at that paper a long moment, set it down on his desk without picking it up proper. This proves a hired man took money from a moneylender, he said. Doesn't prove Vane ordered anything. Man could have acted on his own account, desperate for the funds, and dressed it up after the fact as somebody else's instruction to soften the blow of admitting his own choice. That's not what happened, Ezra said. I'm telling you plain what happened. I believe you believe that. Tolliver's voice hadn't changed pitch once through the whole exchange, flat and unbothered as creek water in August. Doesn't make it evidence a judge would hang a wealthy man's reputation on. Word of a hired hand caught in the act, against a respected landowner's denial. You understand how that plays in a courtroom, Garrett. Same as I do. You're not even going to ask him. Ask who what, Vane? Ask him plain if he ordered this. Tolliver almost smiled then. And what exactly do you expect a man like that to say if I wrote out and asked him straight? Garrett, I'll be honest with you. Since honesty seems to be the currency you're trading in this morning, I've got a badge, and a salary the town can barely afford some years. And a man like Vane could make both of those things considerably harder to hold on to than they already are, without ever once breaking a law doing it. I'll write this up. I'll file it. Don't expect it to move fast, and don't expect it to move at all without more than desperate man's words standing behind it. Joe stepped forward then, close enough that Tolliver finally did shift in his chair, boots coming down off the desk for the first time since we'd walked in. Let me understand you plain, Sheriff. She said, her voice even, careful. The same voice she used, walking a spooked colt down from its own fear. A man's fence gets cut. His note gets called the same season, by the very neighbor who'd twice offered to buy his land. His hired hand confesses on his own word to being coerced by that same neighbor's agent. And your considered opinion, sitting there with your boots up, is that none of it adds to anything worth your riding out to ask one simple question. My considered opinion, Tolliver said, some heat finally showing under the flat of his voice, is that I've got exactly one badge and exactly one salary, and spending either of them chasing a rich man's shadow on the word of his own hired hand isn't a wager I'm inclined to make. Miss Larkin, you've been in this valley, what, a season? I've been sheriff here 11 years. I know how this plays out better than either of you seem willing to hear. I know exactly how it plays out too, Sheriff, Joe said. I've watched it play out before, in a different valley, on a farm that isn't standing anymore because everyone around it decided the fight wasn't worth their own paycheck. I'd hoped Wyoming might be different. I'm starting to understand it isn't, not on its own, not without somebody willing to make it different. Tolliver held her look a long moment, and something in his face shifted. Not quite shame, not quite anything I could name clean, but something. He didn't answer her, just looked back down at Ezra's crumpled note still sitting untouched on his desk. I looked at him a long while, understood finally fully the shape of what I was up against. Not just vain, the whole quiet architecture a rich man builds around himself in a small valley, a banker who wouldn't say a name, a sheriff who wouldn't lift a boot, and how much of that architecture ran on nothing more than ordinary men protecting ordinary paychecks, one careful non-decision at a time. "Thank you for your time, Sheriff," I said, and it cost me plenty to say it civil. We were most of the way back to the horses before Joe spoke. "He's not going to help," she said, "not a question." "No, then we don't need his help." She swung up onto Ulysses, looked at me across the cold street. "We need something bigger than one hired hand's word, something a whole valley can stand behind at once. Loud enough that one sheriff's boots on one desk can't make it quiet again." "Such as what?" "Such as whatever's true about that water," she said. "Vane's whole plan hinges on filing something legal before anybody thinks to question a handshake 3 generations old, which means somewhere there's a handshake. And handshakes, sometimes, get written down anyway, by careful men, even when nobody thought the paper would ever matter." I sat with that a long moment, cold settling through my coat, and thought of one careful man in particular who might know. We passed the land office on our way out of town, its gold lettering catching the thin winter sun, and through the good glass window, I caught sight of Vane himself, seated at a fine desk, going through papers with the same unhurried care I brought to everything. He looked up as we passed, held my eye a long moment through that glass, and something in his expression, satisfaction, maybe, or simple confirmation that his morning's business with the sheriff had gone exactly as he'd expected it to, settled cold in my chest. He didn't know yet what we were riding toward. Didn't know an old man 3 miles south kept an iron-bound trunk full of 30-year-old promises, or that a notebook sat waiting in my own front room, tucked in a drawer I hadn't thought to open in 3 years, holding a dead woman's careful, unheeded warning. I held his look until we'd passed the window fully, and something in me settled too, though considerably warmer than what I ever did in him. Let him have his satisfaction a little longer. It wouldn't last. "Amos Pruitt," I said. Amos had known my father since before either of them had wives, back when this whole valley was 6 families and a great deal more hope than fence line. He'd farmed a modest spread 3 miles south, widowed himself these past 4 years, and kept everybody in the valley knew it, though nobody had ever had cause to ask after it. Directly every scrap of paper that had ever passed through his hands in 50 years of careful, stubborn record-keeping. We rode out that same afternoon. He was mending a hinge on his own barn door. When we came up the drive, a small, weathered man near 70, quick-eyed despite the years, who straightened up slow and looked at the two of us a long moment before he spoke. "Garrett Shaw," he said, "and I don't believe I know the young lady." "Josephine Larkin," Joe said, offering her hand plain, the way she offered most things. "Well." Amos shook it, something like approval crossing his weathered face at the firmness of her grip. "Come in out of the cold, then. I expect you've not ridden 3 miles in December for the pleasure of my company alone." His house was small, tidy in the particular way of a man who's lived alone long enough to have made his own peace with order. A single photograph sat on the mantel, a woman I took to be his late wife, and Amos caught me looking at it as he set the coffee to warm. 41 years we had, he said, unprompted, following my gaze. "Lost her to the same fever season that took a good many folks in this valley. Your own dear wife among them. God rest her. I think on her most every evening still, sitting right in that chair you're sitting in now." He shook his head slow, a small private motion. "A man gets old alone in this country. He starts noticing things nobody younger has the patience to notice. Starts remembering things nobody else thinks to ask him about anymore." "Is that why you kept all this paper?" Joe asked, gentle. "The noticing." "Partly," he smiled, small and dry. "Partly it's just habit. Man spends 50 years signing his name to things. He gets curious what became of half of it. Started keeping copies of my own accord, long before anybody thought there'd ever be cause to need them again." We sat at his table while his coffee warmed, and I told him the whole of it, the note, Vane, the fence, Ezra, the water rights filing Joe had overheard, mentioned through that office window. Amos listened without interrupting, same patient quiet Joe herself brought to most things. And when I had finished, he sat a long while just looking into his own cup before he answered. Your father worried about this exact thing. He said finally, near 30 years back, when this valley was still young enough that nobody'd thought to fight over water yet, because there was more of it than anybody needed at the time. He wasn't a man who trusted good fortune to hold forever. Your father used to say a valley's peace is only ever as strong as its worst-case paper. What paper? I said. Amos stood, slow, joints protesting the cold, and went to a trunk against the far wall. Iron-bound, the kind of trunk built to outlast the man who owned it. He worked the lock a long moment, hands unsteady with age but sure of their purpose, and came back with a folded document, the paper gone soft and yellow at the creases. 1856, he said, setting it on the table between us. 6 families signed this, your father among them, agreeing the water running through Willow Creek belonged to the whole of the valley jointly, not to any single claim along its banks. However that claim happened to sit relative to the current, filed it at the county seat proper. Same year, though I'd wager good money, nobody's looked at that particular filing in 20 years or more, buried the way old records get buried under newer business. I unfolded it with hands that weren't entirely steady themselves. My father's signature sat there plain, his careful, deliberate hand, alongside 5 others I recognized as families who'd since sold up, moved on, or in Denton's case were still hanging on by threads I hadn't understood the tension of until Ridley had explained it to me at the bank. This is exactly what Vane's trying to file over, Joe said, reading it quick, her eyes moving fast down the page, the way they moved down any column of figures that mattered. He's betting nobody remembers this exists, betting the handshake's gone soft enough with time that a new filing, clean and modern, just walks right over it unquestioned. Then he's betting wrong, Amos said, so long as this paper's still good in the eyes of the county, which I see no legal reason it wouldn't be. Filed proper, witnessed proper, never once superseded by anything since. Would you testify to it, I asked, in front of the whole valley, if it came to that? Amos looked at me a long moment, something steady and old and unshakable in his weathered face. Your father stood beside me at my own wife's funeral, Garrett, back when this valley knew how to stand together, instead of watching each other drown separate out of pride. I'd have testified to this paper's truth 30 years ago if anybody'd asked me to. I'll testify to it now. We rode home with that document folded careful inside my coat, close against my chest the whole way, and I don't mind telling you I felt something in my chest loosen that had been clenched tight since Ridley's letter first arrived. It was Jo who found the second piece 3 nights later, and she found it in the last place either of us thought to look. She'd taken to going through the desk in the front room, some evenings, organizing what she called my father's paper chaos into something closer to order, and it was there, in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old feed receipts, that she found Eliza's notebook. I hadn't known it existed. Want that said plain. 7 years married to a woman, and I hadn't known she'd kept a private notebook separate from the household ledger, tucked away in a drawer I rarely opened, filled with her own particular observations about the ranch, the valley, the weather, in a hand I'd have known anywhere on this earth. Jo brought it to me quiet, careful, the way you hand a person something that might hurt them and might heal them, and you're not entirely certain ahead of time which it's going to do. You should read this, she said, the last third of it. I only looked because I was trying to sort what was worth keeping. I read it alone. That night, by lamplight, in a silence Jo gave me without my having to ask for it. Most of it was ordinary weather, the health of stock. A line here and there about me that stopped my breath entirely small. Private observations, the kind a woman writes down for no one but herself. And I won't share all of what I read there, because some things a man keeps. But near the last pages, dated the autumn before she took sick, Eliza had written something else entirely. Stakes appeared along the north boundary again today, she'd written. 3rd time this year. Not ours. Not any survey crew I recognize, and no notice filed at the county seat that Garrett's aware of. Told him. He says it's likely nothing. Some land company scouting ahead of the railroad talk everybody's been chewing on all season. I am not so certain it's nothing. A man scouting openly files notice, and scouting quiet is hoping nobody asks him why. Further down, a later entry, close to the last full page she ever wrote. Before the fever took the strength for writing from her entirely, told Garrett again about the stakes. He is carrying too much this season to carry one more worry, and I did not press it the way I should have. I intend to write to the county surveyor myself, quiet, and find out plain who has been walking our northern line without so much as the courtesy of a knock at the door first. There was no record she'd ever sent that letter. The fever had come on within weeks of that entry, fast, and taken every ounce of her attention, along with everything else it took. I sat with that notebook a long while, grief and something close to fury tangled together in a way I hadn't expected and didn't fully know what to do with, because she'd seen it. 3 years before Vane ever rode up my drive with his fine coat and hollow smile, my own wife had seen the first quiet stakes of exactly the plan he was executing now, and I'd told her it was likely nothing, and she'd carried that unease alone, unpressed, right up until something considerably larger took her from carrying anything at all. Joe found me still sitting there past midnight, the lamp burned low, and didn't say anything at first. Just sat down across from me, quiet, the way she knew how to be quiet exactly as long as a moment required. She saw it coming, I said finally, years before any of us, and I told her it was nothing. You didn't know then what you know now. Joe's voice was gentle, but not soft in the way that lets a person off easy. Nobody could have known then what this would grow into. That's not a failure, Garrett. That's just what it looks like, living a life forward instead of backward. She tried to tell me, and she's telling you now, Joe said, same as she told you then. Just took longer to reach you this time is all. Doesn't make the warning any less true, or any less hers. She reached across the table, laid her hand over the notebook, over my own hand resting beside it. This is evidence, Garrett. Whatever else it is to you, whatever grief it's stirred up tonight, it's also exactly what we need. Dated stakes, years before Vane's name ever entered your life plane. That's not coincidence a judge or a valley full of neighbors can wave off easy. I looked at her a long while in that low lamplight, her hand still resting over mine, and understood, not for the first time, but maybe for the first time fully, how a person could carry grief and hope in the same chest at once, without either one canceling the other out. Eliza had seen the danger and hadn't lived to fight it. Joe had ridden into the middle of it, uninvited, and hadn't once flinched from the fight since. Thank you, I said, for finding this, for sitting with me while I read it. You don't need to thank me for that any more than you needed to thank me the first morning I told you the valley was wrong about you. She squeezed my hand once, brief, and let it go. Some things a person just does, Garrett, because the doing of them is its own reason. I rode out to the small cemetery behind the West Road Church 2 mornings later, alone, before first light, something in me needing to visit before the meeting rather than after. Eliza's stone sat plain among the others, her name and the years cut clean by a mason who'd known her personally, same as most everyone in this valley once had. I hadn't visited near as often as I ought to have, that first hard year giving way slow to a second and third, where the visiting had become something I did on her birthday, on our anniversary, and precious little in between. Standing there that cold February morning, I found I had more to say to her than I'd expected. You saw it first, I said, out loud, to a headstone in a valley gone quiet and gray around me. 3 years before any of us. I should have listened closer. I should have done a great many things closer where you were concerned, and I'm sorry for the ones I didn't manage. The wind moved through the bare trees along the fence line, and I stood there a long while longer, not expecting an answer, not needing one exactly, just needing the saying of it. I've found somebody, Eliza. The words came harder than I expected, though not from any guilt I could name plain more. The particular difficulty of saying a true thing out loud for the first time, even to the dead, even to a woman I trusted, would understand better than anyone living. Her name's Joe. She's steady and sharp, and she reads a ledger near as true as you used to. I think you'd have liked her. I think, knowing you, you'd have told me plain to stop wasting good daylight being uncertain about it. I stayed until the sun cleared the ridge proper and rode home lighter than I'd ridden out, carrying something that felt less like grief finally released and more like grief finally given proper company to sit beside. We called the meeting for the following Saturday at the Grange Hall in Millbrook, the largest room in town outside the church itself, rode to every spread within a day's reach. The two of us splitting the valley between us, delivering the invitation by hand rather than trusting it to gossip or a posted notice Vane's people might tear down before it did its work. Denton was the hardest door to knock on. I stood on his porch a long while before he finally answered, and when he saw who it was, his face did something complicated. Shame, mostly. I'd come to understand, 2 years of shame finally meeting the man he'd been too proud to face honest. Garrett, he didn't meet my eye at first. I know about your note, I said plain. No accusation in it, only fact, Ridley told me. I'm not here to shame you, Denton. I'm here because I think Vane's made the same mistake with both of us, thinking 2 proud men would rather drown quiet than admit they're standing in the same water. Something in his face broke then, the particular breaking of a man who's carried a shame alone far longer than any shame ought to be carried solo. 2 years, he said. 2 years I let you think I'd gone cold on you out of judgment, when the truth was, I couldn't stand to look at my own trouble reflected back at me, in yours. He shook his head slow. I'm sorry for that, Garrett. More than I know how to say plain. Come Saturday, I said. Bring whatever paper you've got. Bring your wife, your hands. Anybody who'll stand up and say plain what's been done to this valley these past 2 years. It's time this whole thing stopped happening in the dark. One proud, silent man at a time, he came. Every spread we visited came. In the end, some out of anger finally given permission to speak, some out of simple curiosity, a few, I expect, out of nothing more than the particular hunger a small valley develops for drama after a long, quiet winter. But they came. Near 40 people crowded into that Grange Hall on a cold Saturday evening, lamplight thick and yellow against every window, and Vane himself sitting near the back with Coyle beside him, and a face gone carefully, deliberately, unreadable. Jo stood with me at the front of that hall, close enough that her shoulder brushed mine, and I felt steadier for it than I'd have admitted to anyone but her. Whatever happens tonight, she said, low, just for me. You're not standing here alone. Whole room full of people who've been alone too long, same as you have. Let them see that plain, and the rest tends to follow on its own. Amos spoke first. The old document read aloud plain in a voice that had gone thin with age but hadn't lost 1 ounce of its certainty. 6 signatures. My father's among them, agreeing this valley's water belonged to the whole of it, filed proper 30 years back and never once superseded. I knew every man who signed this paper, Amos said, holding it up so the lamplight caught the yellowed edges plain. Buried 3 of them myself. They didn't sign it thinking it'd matter 30 years on. They signed it because they trusted each other, plain and simple, the way neighbors are supposed to trust each other in hard country. I'd hate to see that trust proven foolish now, this late over one man's patience and the rest of ours giving out too soon. Then Ezra, standing beside me, hat in his hands, telling the whole room what he'd told the sheriff, the debt. Coyle, the instructions passed down, clean to keep his own fingerprints clear of the doing. His voice shook through most of it. Didn't stop him finishing. I'm not proud of what I did, he said, looking out at faces he'd known 11 years, some of them softening as he spoke, a few staying hard. Martha's alive because of the money that bought my silence, and I won't pretend I regret that part of it, whatever else I regret. But I'm standing here tonight because Garrett Shaw gave me a chance most men wouldn't have given, and I intend to spend the rest of my days earning it, starting with telling every one of you the plain truth of what's been happening in this valley. A woman near the front, Denton's wife, I recognized her, spoke up unprompted, her voice carrying clear across the quiet hall. We near lost our own place last spring. Never told a soul outside our own kitchen. Thought it was our shame alone to carry. So did we. Another voice added. From further back, one of the smaller outfits, along the creek's western bend, a family I barely knew beyond a wave at the mercantile. Man came round in the fall, talking about a note we hadn't even realized had changed hands. The murmur that followed wasn't like the one that would come later, after Vane spoke. This one was softer, sadder, the particular sound of a room discovering all at once that its private griefs had been shared, silent, in nearly every house along that valley floor. I read from Eliza's notebook last, the stakes she'd seen 3 years before. Any of this had a name attached to it, and I watched something shift across that room as I read, watched neighbors who'd nodded polite through Amos's paper, and Ezra's confession lean forward now, because a dead woman's private worry, read aloud plain in her husband's grieving voice, carried a weight that paper alone couldn't quite match. This has been happening to this valley for 2 years, I said, when I'd finished, looking out at faces I'd known most of my life. Some warmed toward me, some cool, all of them listening now in a way they hadn't been listening an hour before. Quiet. One family at a time, each of us thinking our trouble was our own private shame to bear alone. Denton's note. The Coles, driven off before most of us understood why. My own fence, cut by a desperate man following us he didn't have the power to refuse. And now a water filing meant to finish what all of that started. Filed clean and legal before anybody thought to remember a handshake made when most of us in this room weren't yet born. I looked at Vane directly then, sitting still and careful near the back of that hall. I'm not asking this valley to take up arms tonight, I said. I'm asking it to take up its own memory. To stop letting one man's patience outlast our pride, one silent, ashamed family at a time. Vane stood, slow, unhurried, same unhurried he'd ridden up my drive with weeks before. A moving speech, Garrett, he said, and his voice carried easy across that quiet room. Practiced, the voice of a man who'd talked his way out of harder rooms than this one. But speeches aren't law. That document Mr. Prutz produced is 30 years old and untested. A hired man's confession, given under obvious duress and obvious motive to shift blame from his own poor choices. A dead woman's private notebook, which proves nothing beyond the fact that she was, by your own account, uncertain herself what she was seeing. It proves you've been circling this valley for years. Denton said, standing now himself, his voice carrying its own hard certainty. Same as you circled my note. Same as you circled Cole's, before he gave up and left rather than fight you. We're not fools, Van Gain. We were ashamed. Different thing entirely. And shame, I'm finding out tonight, doesn't hold up half so well once a room full of neighbors decides to stop being ashamed together. A murmur went through that hall then, low and building, the particular sound of a room's opinion shifting all at once, faster than any one voice could have managed alone. Vane looked out over that murmur a long moment, and for the first time since I'd known him, something in his careful composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for a man watching close to catch it. This valley will do business with me regardless, he said. Document or no document, notebook or no notebook. The railroad's coming whether any of you choose to stand together tonight or not, and when it comes, the land along this water will be worth 10 times what it's worth today. I've simply been early to understand that. There's no crime in foresight, gentlemen. There's a crime in cutting a man's fence to force him toward ruin, Ezra said, his voice steadier now than it had been all evening. There's a crime in threatening a sick woman's medicine to buy a desperate man's silence. I know because I was the man, and you were the one who arranged it. Careful, Mr. Combs, Vane said, something colder entering his voice now, the practiced warmth finally slipping. Slander's a serious accusation to make in front of 40 witnesses. It's not slander if it's true, Amos said, standing again, his old voice carrying a weight it hadn't quite carried the first time. And I've known this valley long enough to recognize the particular sound of a room deciding, all at once, what it believes. I'd listen close if I were you, Mr. Vane. That sound's not on your side tonight. Denton's wife stood then too, unbidden, her voice steady despite the tremor I could see in her hands. You told my husband privately that our note would go easier on us if we kept quiet about the terms and didn't go comparing notes with the neighbors. I remember it plain because I sat in the room when you said it. Funny thing to ask of an honest business arrangement, Mr. Vane. Asking a man to keep it secret from his own neighbors. A ripple went through the crowd at that, sharper than the murmur before it, and I watched 2 more families lean toward each other, whispering some private confirmation passing between them that clearly matched what Denton's wife had just said aloud. The room had gone fully quiet by then, waiting, and I watched Vane do the same arithmetic I'd been doing for weeks. Watched him understand, plain on his face, despite every ounce of practice he'd spent learning to hide such things, that he'd lost something in that hall. He wasn't going to get back with any amount of careful, practiced composure, not the water rights fight. Not entirely, not yet. That would still take lawyers, and time, and Amos's steady old testimony carried all the way to the county seat if it came to that. But something larger than the water. The particular unquestioned authority a rich man carries in a small valley only so long as everyone around him stays quiet and ashamed and separate. He left without another word, Coyle trailing behind him, and the door hadn't fully shut behind them before the whole room broke into conversation at once. Neighbors turning to neighbors. 2 years of separate silence finally finding its way back into something like a valley, talking to itself again. Sheriff Tolliver had sat through the whole meeting near the door, saying nothing. And I caught his eye once as the room broke apart around us. Something in his face had changed too, some private calculation of his own shifting behind it. And I understood, watching him, that a man who'd been willing to look away for one rich man's convenience might find that considerably harder to manage once. 40 of his own neighbors had watched him do it in plain sight. Joe and I walked home that night, rather than ride. The horses led easy behind us, the cold clear and bracing after the crowded warmth of the hall. Neither one of us spoke for the first mile. Both of us, I think, still settling into the shape of what had just happened. You did that, she said finally, breaking the quiet. Not Amos's paper alone, not Ezra's confession alone, not even Eliza's notebook alone. You standing up in front of people who'd known you your whole life and telling them plain what had been done to this valley. That took more than any one piece of evidence could have managed by itself. Couldn't have done it without you riding into a stranger's office and listening at a window you'd every right to walk past instead. Maybe. She was quiet a moment, our boots crunching steady over the frozen road. I think I'd have done it anyway, though, evidence or no evidence eventually falling into our laps. Some fights choose a person more than a person chooses them. She glanced at me sideways. This one chose me the morning I found your fence cut and understood, plain, that somebody meant real harm to a man who hadn't done a thing to deserve it. Well, I found her hand in the dark, cold through her glove, and held it the rest of the way home. I'm glad it chose you. Glad you chose to answer it. The water rights fight took the better part of the winter's remaining weeks to settle proper. Filed and argued at the county seat with Amos's document as its spine. Denton and 3 other families standing alongside as witnesses to a valley's memory finally speaking with one voice instead of many separate, silent ones. Vane's own filing, rushed and thin against 30 years of settled paper, didn't survive the challenge. The note against my own land settled different and slower, and I won't pretend the details of it make for the most exciting telling a lawyer out of Cheyenne, engaged jointly by 4 ranching families who'd finally understood the wisdom of facing a large trouble together instead of 4 separate, smaller ones, argued the note itself had been called in bad faith, timed deliberately to a season of proven hardship rather than any genuine business need. Ridley, for his part, seemed almost relieved to have the whole matter taken out of his hands and settled by parties with more standing than his own uneasy conscience had managed alone. Denton and I fell back into something like the old ease between our 2 places, faster than I'd have guessed possible after 2 years of cold silence. He rode over himself, first week of February, no errand attached to the visit beyond the visit itself, and stood in my yard a long while before he finally said what he'd come to say. Wanted to buy stock off you again, he said. Spring foals when they're ready. Same as we used to before I let my own pride talk me into 2 years of nothing. I'd like that, I said, and meant it plain. And I wanted to say I'm sorry, he added, gruff, the words costing him plenty, for the silence, for letting you think it was judgment, when it was never anything but my own shame looking for a place to hide. Pride's a heavy thing to carry alone, Denton. I understand it better than I'd like to. He nodded, looked out at the horses a moment, and something in his weathered face eased. Feels a good deal lighter. Shared out among a whole valley instead of carried solo. I'll say that much for your Saturday meeting, Garrett. Near 40 people finally admitting the same trouble all at once. I haven't felt this valley stand together like that since before the war, if my own father's stories are worth anything. Sheriff Tolliver resigned his post that same February, quiet, without much explanation offered beyond a note pinned to his own office door, and a younger man from Cheyenne took the badge inside the month. I never learned for certain what became of Tolliver after, whether shame had finally caught up with him or whether he'd simply read Valley's changed mood plain enough to know his usefulness to men like Vane had run its course. Either way, Willow Creek Valley got itself a sheriff that spring, who answered his own door when a rancher came calling with a genuine trouble, and that, in the end, was improvement enough for most folks to let the rest of it lie. By the time the snow began its slow giveaway into mud, the note stood extended on ordinary terms. The water rights stood confirmed exactly as they'd stood since 1856, and Jonas Vane had sold his own spread quiet within the month and left this valley for whatever fresh ground he intended to circle next. Patient and hollow smiled somewhere else entirely, out past the reach of anything Willow Creek Valley could still teach him about the particular cost of underestimating people who finally decide to stop being ashamed alone. I heard secondhand from a cattle buyer passing through that summer that Vane had turned up in a valley 2 territories over, already circling a different set of small outfits with the same patient offers, the same fine coat, the same careful arithmetic of pressure applied slow at exactly the right points. I don't know if that valley found its own Amos Pruitt, its own iron-bound trunk of 30-year-old promises. I hope for their sake they did. A man like that doesn't stop circling just because one valley finally taught him the cost of it. He simply rides on looking for softer ground until he finds a place too tired or too proud or too separated from itself to stand together the way this one finally learned to. Coyle, for his part, left Wyoming territory entirely, and nobody in Millbrook much mourned the leaving. Martha Combs's health improved slow through that same stretch, the tonic doing its work better once worry stopped competing with medicine for whatever strength she had left to spend. Ezra worked that whole spring like a man determined to pay a debt no court had ever actually charged him for, and some evenings, watching him out past dusk mending fence, Nobody had asked him to mend that particular day. I understood he was paying it anyway, in the only currency he had left that felt honest to him. Spring came in earnest by April, green pushing up hard and fast through ground that had held nothing but white for what felt by then like a decade rather than a season. 3 mares came due that spring. The 2 Joe had told me to hold back among them, and it was the middle one, a night deep in April with rain coming soft and steady against the barn roof, that brought Joe and me both out to the barn past midnight, same as it had that first hard winter I'd once believed had nothing left to give me. The foal came at dawn, clean, a dark bay colt with 1 white sock, up on his legs and nursing within the hour, steam rising off his dam's flanks in the cold gray morning light. Joe stood beside me at the stall rail, shoulder against my arm, and neither one of us said anything for a long while, the particular quiet of 2 people who no longer needed words to fill every space between them. Same rail, she said finally, quiet. Different season. Different everything, I said, except the 2 of us standing here. Not so different, that part. She glanced at me sideways. You were half in love with me the very first morning, Garrett Shaw. Don't bother denying it. I've got a good eye for reading what a creature's thinking, and you're not half so difficult to read as you seem to believe. Is that so? That's so. Something almost mischievous crossed her face, there in the gray dawn light. Took you considerably longer to catch up to it out loud than it took the rest of you to feel it, though. I'll grant you that much credit at least for eventually getting there. I've been meaning to say something to you, I said finally, echoing, without entirely meaning to, the words Ezra's interruption had scattered weeks before. Been meaning to since before the note, before the meeting, before any of it. Kept losing my nerve. You've got no nerve left to lose. Garrett Shaw, she said, though her voice had gone soft around the teasing. Say it now before something else comes hollering through that door. I love you. Plain as that. No circling left in me to do it any other way. Have for longer than I let myself admit. Watching you work this ranch back to something worth having. Watching you ride out into weather most sensible people wouldn't ride into. Twice. For a man, and a place that weren't yours to fight for. I'd like them to be yours, if you'll have them. If you'll have me. She looked at me a long moment in that gray dawn light, the foal finding his feet steady behind her, and whatever answer she'd been carrying seemed, in that particular moment, to arrive exactly as certain as everything else she'd ever told me plain. I decided that a good while back, she said. Longer than you'd probably guess, if I'm honest. I just didn't see much sense in saying it before you'd caught up to the deciding yourself. That a yes, then? That's a yes. Something close to a real smile broke across her face then, full and warm. The kind I'd only caught glimpses of before. Though I'll expect you to keep up better next time I hand you an opening, Garrett. A woman can only wait so many interrupted evenings before she starts wondering if a man's nerve is ever going to catch its own breath. I laughed, the foal startling slightly at the sound, before settling back into his mother's steady warmth, and I put my arm around Joe there in that lamplit barn, the rain easing outside toward full morning, and felt, for the first time in longer than I could rightly measure, that the arithmetic of my whole life had finally fully come out right. We married the first Saturday in June at the same Grange Hall that had held 40 neighbors and one hard reckoning that winter, though the mood that Saturday carried nothing but light in it. Amos stood as witness, proud in a way that reminded me plain of my own father, whom I thought of often that day without any of the old grief pulling as hard as it once had. Ezra stood beside me, Martha on his arm. Her color returned enough by June that she laughed loud and often through the whole small celebration. Denton came, and his wife and near every family who'd stood in that hall. The night Vane's careful composure finally cracked. The preacher was young, new to Millbrook that spring, and he talked longer than the moment strictly needed about the particular virtue of a valley that had learned to stand together, having heard, same as everyone else in that room, the story of the winter just past. I didn't mind the length of it, sat there holding Joe's hand, feeling the whole weight of everything the last 6 months had asked of us settle, finally, into something that felt less like weight and more like simple, solid ground. Martha caught my eye partway through the ceremony, tears standing plain and unashamed on her face, and I understood, watching her, that she carried her own particular gratitude that day, not just for a marriage, but for a husband who'd been given the chance to earn his way back to trust, instead of losing everything to one hard winter's desperation. Joe wore blue cloth she'd ordered from Cheyenne back in March, before either of us had said the words out loud that made the ordering anything more than hopeful. She told me that after, standing at the window of our own house that evening, the two of us watching the horses move easy through gold June light in the south pasture. You ordered the cloth before I'd said anything, I said. I decided before you'd said anything, she said. Told you that already in the barn. I don't generally see much use in waiting around for a man to catch up to a decision I've already made careful and certain in my own mind. That's supposed to make me feel foolish, Josephine Larkin Shaw? Supposed to make you feel loved. She said, though I understand those can feel a good deal alike. Coming from a woman built the way I'm built. She leaned her head against my shoulder. Easy, decided. No performance left in it at all. 10 years you kept this place standing, mostly alone. That's not nothing, Garrett. Whatever the valley thought of you those hard years, whatever you thought of yourself some cold mornings sitting on that porch step, that's not nothing. We're building something now, I said. Together. We are, she agreed. And out past the window the foals moved easy among the mares in the long grass. Dark bay against green, steady in sound and entirely, impossibly ours. I think sometimes, evenings like that one, about the particular morning it all started, the cold coffee, the empty trail, a man who'd decided, in his bones, that the arithmetic of his whole life had finally stopped working, right before it heard hooves coming around a bend it hadn't thought to watch anymore. 12 horses came home that morning, but it was the woman behind them, and everything she carried with her, that I couldn't yet see clear from that porch step, that changed the whole shape of what this valley, and this ranch, and this one stubborn man, still had left to become. I think, too, about all the quiet architecture that nearly brought this place down before anyone rode up singing about it. Plain a banker who wouldn't say a name, a sheriff who wouldn't lift a boot, a whole valley of proud, ashamed neighbors, each convinced their trouble was theirs alone to carry. Took a woman with a straight eye and a stubborn heart to teach this valley what it had nearly forgotten, that the water belongs to all of us, that the shame belongs to none of us. Not really. Not once we're honest enough to share it out loud. That a fence cut in the dark can't undo 6 years, or 20, or however long a person spent building something worth defending, so long as somebody's willing to stand at the gate and fight for it. Ezra still works this place, same as he did before, though something between us has settled into a trust rebuilt slower and more carefully than the trust that came before it. Not lesser for the rebuilding, I've found, just different. Martha comes by most Sundays now, color full back in her face, and brings a pie most times, and never once mentions the winter that nearly cost her everything, though I catch her looking at Joe sometimes with a gratitude too large for either of them to put into easy words. The lamp burns in that same barn window most nights now, same as it did the winter this all began, and some evenings, walking out to stand beside my wife, while she sits with the mare close to her time, I catch myself thinking the arithmetic finally fully works out fine. Not because the numbers ever stopped being hard, because I finally understood, watching a woman ride an ugly gray mule around that bend out of nowhere, that a man was never meant to do the sum alone in the first place.